Drums are covered, banners are furled, and the camp is tidied. This is medieval war without the noise. A gentle tour through training yards, armories, siege walls, field chapels, and the long shadow of peace. A knight did not spring fully formed from saddle and steel. He was grown like an oak, slow, deliberate, season by season, ring by ring. Before the banners and spurs, before the oath and the charge, there were years of small obediences, learning where to put a foot, how to hold a gaze, when to bend and when to stand. The make of a knight began in childhood and ended, if it ended at all, only at death, for even honour must be kept sharpened like a blade. Blades, like reputations, sulk if neglected. In the great hall of a lord, where rushes were strewn and hounds lay under benches, a boy of 7 might be taken from his mother's hand and given to a new household. He arrived with a small bundle, a larger fear, and a name that would be shaped by other mouths. He became a page, a small servant to greater duties. He learned first to be useful, to carry trenchers and cups without spilling, to fetch messages swiftly through corridors that echoed with his own footsteps, to keep his tongue and his temper when older lads laughed. Courtesy was not ornament, it was armour for the unarmoured, politeness the cheapest mail. The page's world was a school of eyes and hands. He watched the lady of the house, learning the quiet economy of command, a lifted brow, a precise word. He watched the steward, who could reckon bread and beer for 100 mouths with a glance at the larder. From him the boy gleaned that order saves men as surely as courage. He watched the lord at table, measuring how a man holds himself when others watch, and how a man listens when others speak. He learned the names of guests, the crests on their shields, the kinships that tied and tangled the realm. To serve was to study. Homework included napkin folding and dynastic drama. There were games too, made as serious as prayers. In the courtyard he ran until breath burned, learning how the body answers command. He wrestled with boys stronger than himself, and learned both defeat and its cure. He threw light javelins at straw, and if he missed, he fetched them with a smile. He learned to leap to a horse's back with a hand on mane and one foot in air, laughing at failure and repeating the leap until the laugh turned to triumph. Even play had a purpose. The muscles built by joy are the ones that last. Also, the straw never complained. Older boys wore a different name, squire. Between page and knight lay this narrower bridge, built of harder boards. A squire took one master into his daily keeping, his harness, his weapons, his horse, his honour. He learned the way mail sings when lifted, the places where links tire and must be mended, the patient art of rubbing rust from rings until they shine like fish in a stream. He learned to lace vambraces until a knight's hand could flex, to buckle greaves so shin did that chafe, to settle a helm so neck could bear its weight without complaint. A squire's failure was a knight's wound. A squire's care could be a knight's life. Job description. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Dawn often found the squires in the yard with wooden swords that smarted like truth. They drilled in pairs, cut and parry, thrust and bind. The sequence repeated until the body remembered when the mind forgot. They learned to keep the shield high without hiding their own sight, to step offline rather than retreat, to use the weight of an opponent's strike to open a path for their own. Bruises bloomed like small lessons. Pride was the one rash that must not be scratched. The master-at-arms paced among them, a stick in hand sharper than any tongue, rapping a lazy elbow, lifting a sagging guard, teaching with blows that were never cruel but never soft. Customer feedback was immediate and wooden. Bows had their hour as well. Though the longbow belonged more to the yeoman, even gentle-born lads were taught to feel a string's bite. They stood with feet set like roots, and pulled until shoulders sang, until the breath matched the arrow's path. Squires learned respect for those who could bend a bow that took a man's height to string. They learned that no helm can despise a shaft that comes hissing from a hedge. If pride rose, the butts corrected it. A stray wind or a straying thought sets a feathered truth straight through arrogance. Archery, humbling since forever. Horses were tutors with their own curriculum. A squire learned stable before saddle, currycomb stroke, hoofs clean, the smell that means grain enough and the smell that means mould. He learned a good mouth from a bad, a hollow back from a sound one, a temper from an eye that rolls too white. He fed before he ate. He watered before he drank. When he mounted, he rode not as a passenger but as a partner. Thighs firm, heels light, hand steady. He guided a destrier through figures chalked on the yard-tight turns, sudden halts, smooth advances, until horse and rider moved like two notes sung as one. The horse graded on a curve, but remembered everything. Armour had a voice the squire learned to hear. Mail whispered as it settled. Plate spoke in jointed syntax. Leather answered with creak and sigh. Weight taught humility first, how much a man asks of his legs, how honest a back must be. But weight taught confidence next. Once born, it became a second skin, a shell the world struck in vain. The boy inside learned to be patient with himself, to breathe in shallower rhythm, to trust that fatigue would retreat before will if will held steady. Armour doesn't make a man brave, it makes him honest about how bravery feels. Also, it makes stares longer. The tourney field was theatre and school together. On saints' days or feasts, when banners bloomed like gardens and trumpets braided the air with silver thread, squires led their masters' horses out, eyes bright, hands calm. They watched the tilt. Lances shivered, splinters flew, cheers rose and rolled like surf. In the melee, they saw chaos ordered by custom teams, colliding in a press of snorting horses and hammering shields. Capture worth more than killing, honour worth more than gain. When a knight was unhorsed, a squire darted in, swift and brave, to guard or rescue, to bring a fresh lance, to lead the rider back before pride could limber into shame. Lost lances, found humility. At night, in the hall, when lamps made small suns of oil, the younger sat at the edge of older men's speech, and learned the law that does not live on parchment. Whom to trust with a flank, whom to humour and never follow, which lord pays late, which herald does not lie, which wound can be ridden with, which must be hidden, and which must be shown to the priest without delay. They learned that chivalry was not a cloak for preening but a shirt that chafed, if not worn daily. Truth in word, mercy in power, steadiness in danger, service to the helpless, honour kept even when no song will sing it. Not flashy, very washable. Vigils stitched training to vow. On the eve of dubbing, a squire washed and was dressed in white. He spent the night in a chapel alone or with a single friend at the far pew. The sword he hoped to earn lay upon the altar, a line of cold waiting for a warm hand. He knelt, rose, knelt again. He walked. He recited the psalms he knew and hummed the ones he did knit. He remembered wrongs he had done and the faces of those who had forgiven them. Candlelight troubled the painted saints into life. He asked not for victory. Victory is a coin minted by men, but for courage and constancy, which are older currencies and hold their value. Exchange rate remarkably stable. Morning brought ceremony. A bath given by elders to remind that clean hands must do clean work. A belt cinched to remind that strength is girded from within. Spurs buckled, bright little suns at heel, to remind that a man goes where he is needed. A blow light or stinging across the cheek to remind that pain must be met without anger. An oath given aloud before God and men to defend the weak, to keep faith, to honour justice, to shun treachery, to obey rightful command. Then the sword, taken up not as a toy but as a tool, as a trust edge, keen, point sure, heft balanced as a sentence well spoken, also not dishwasher safe. The first rider's night was rarely glorious. It was to the stable, to thank the old groom who had taught the boy not to fear a horse's rolling eye. To the kitchen, to kiss the cook who had slipped him heels of bread when practice ran long, to the chapel, to place a candle where last night's wax had cooled, then perhaps to the yard, to take a young squire's nervous hand and show him how a buckle lies flush if you give it tie and do it recit it. Knighthood repeats its make by make others. Promotion comes with mentoring and more buckles. Training did not end. It changed its tasks. The knight learned command, a harder art than any cut or parry. How to array men so that fear had no empty corners to grow in. How to place those quick to anger where a steady friend could see them. How to send a message that would not be misunderstood in wind and dust. He learned to read the ground as if it were a book, where hooves would founder, where wheels would bite, where a hedge hides friends, where a ridge hides enemies. He learned to listen to scouts who had mud on their boots and truth on their tongues. Management, now with horses. He also learned restraint, the virtue seldom sung. When a village stood before him, thatch trembling like a field in wind, he reined in men whose blood had turned to thunder. He forbade the torch, he forbade the hand that would snatch bread from a child. He set guards at barns and wells, he paid for hay with coin or with promise that would be kept. He treated a captured foe well, first because it was right, second because reputations travel faster than armies. Many a gate has swung open for a captain known to spare. PR, surprisingly medieval. From priests he learned penance, from women patience, from old soldiers the humour that keeps a man's mind from breaking. He allowed the surgeon to cut deeper than pride wanted, because a wound that closes dirty will open a grave. He thanked the archer who had saved his life by an arrow loosed from an unseen hedge, and he did not sneer at the low-born hand that had guided it. He walked the camp by night and spoke to sentries by name. He kept his own sword clean and his own gear in order, for a leader who cannot master a buckle should not master men. Buckles, tiny, tyrannical teachers. There were failures. A horse bolted under a green knight and broke his arm, the lesson bound tighter than the splint. A blow taken for show cost a friend's life, and the memory wrote itself on the inside of eyelids and never faded. A boast in a hall led to a challenge on a field, and to a widow at a window. Training did not prevent such things, it only gave a man a better chance to meet them rightly when they came. Experience is a stern tutor with expensive fees. In winter, when war slept lightly and the land wore its white shirt, the yard rang still. Snow clung to mail like a second frost. Breath made brief ghosts, leather stiffened and needed warming by the fire. Squires ran drills under pale sun, knights practiced with blunted blades, counting steps aloud so rhythm would be theirs when ice cheated feet. Indoors, heralds taught the grammar of colours and beasts, who bore argent or sable, who claimed lions or eagles. Because to know a man's shield is to know his story before he speaks it. Also handy for it hitting your own cousin. Songs seeped into training as water seeps into wool. Minstrels told of warriors who held a ford alone, of ladies whose tokens steadied a shaking hand, of betrayals punished and loyalties rewarded. The young listened and believed too much, the old listened and believed enough. For though songs gild and omit, they point to truths the yard cannot teach, that courage begins in the heart before it reaches the hand, that mercy makes a man heavier in the scale of heaven, that honour lost in a moment takes a lifetime to earn back, and sometimes a lifetime is this enough. Fine print seldom sung. And when war called, when the drumbeat from the last chapter reached the hall, trained rose without fuss. Pages shouldered buckets and carried messages, squires packed haversacks, checked girths, counted spare bowstrings, knights tightened straps, spoke to horses, spoke to God, spoke to the men who would ride beside them. Helmets went on, the world narrowed to a slit and widened in the mind. The long practice of years entered the hands as quietly as a breath. Nothing dramatic, just competence, dangerously effective. A knight rode out not as a hero painted on a shield, but as a man of habits, small courtesies, precise labours, kept oaths. When the charge came, he lowered the lance and trusted the hours when wood sword bruised his forearms and the drill master rapped his guard. When the melee turned to muddle, he trusted the map of ground he carried in his head and the names he knew by heart. When fear rose, he rode within the narrow music of his vow. And if he lived to ride home, he began again the work of shaping boys into men who might one day keep faith under steel. Sequels guaranteed. Thus the making of a knight was the making of a conscience in iron and leather. It bound strength to service, skill to steadiness, courage to care. The world saw the flash of helm and the glitter of spur. The world heard the trumpet. But beneath the polish lay years of saddle sores, blistered palms, aching shoulders, and the slow tender growth of a soul learning how to carry weight without becoming hard. In that long apprenticeship, war found its best answer. What rage but discipline, not pride but duty, not cruelty but the practiced choice of mercy where mercy could be dared. Heroism, mostly paperwork and patience. And when night came to the training yard, because night comes everywhere, last sounds were humble ones, a currycomb clicking against a wooden rail, a boy laughing low at a joke only two share, a man kneeling in the chapel with hands that smelled of oil and horse and iron. The torches smouldered out, the stars took their watch, sleep descended on calloused hands and tired legs, and tomorrow before the bell the yard would wake again, because oaks do not grow in a day, and neither do nights. Set your expectations and your alarm. War, when it comes down from banners and vows to the close work of men's hands, is made of wood, iron, horn, cord, glue, leather, and will. Tools fashioned in quiet places are carried into noisy ones. A sword begins as oar in the dark, a spear begins as ash tree in a hedgerow, a bow begins as a sapling that learned patience in winter winds. The battlefield is only the last page of a long book written by smiths, carvers, fletchers, bowyers, rope makers, tanners, wheelwrights, carters, and the men who bear the weight. To speak of weapons is to follow a chain of craft that stretches from forge to field, from ember to blood. The supply chain, regrettably, does not accept returns. The sword holds pride of place in song, though not always in numbers upon the day. It is a noble companion, balanced, quick, more letter than club, suited to the hand that has learned its grammar. In the smithy, the blade is born in layers, iron heated until it glows like banked sunrise, folded, hammered, tempered, plunged hissing into water or oil, then drawn again to a colour the smith trusts. Lines appear along the metal like the grain of wood, telling a story of strength and flexibility married. A well-made sword rings when struck lightly, a sound like truth clear, exact, uncompromising. It also rings like a bill if you nick a lord's table. Not all swords are alike. The broad cutting blade that loves a downward hew is cousin to the longer, narrower type, whose joy is in the thrust. Pommel and guard do more than adorn, they answer the wrist, balance the swing, catch the enemy's edge before it finds fingers. Leather is wrapped along the hilt so sweat will not betray grip. Sometimes a thin cord lies beneath, biting the palm just enough to warn of slackness. A knight who tends his blade wipes it as one wipes a child's mouth, often, carefully, with something of tenderness. Steel returns what care you give it. Neglect, however, is repaid with spots and shame. Yet the unglamorous spear is older and more numerous, and the ground knows its punctuation. Ash or oak shaft, iron head leaf-shaped or long and square, a butt spike to balance and plant. Spear is democratic, efficient, obedient to drill. Set in close ranks with shields overlapping, spears become a fence that walks. Their points make a thicket in which horses balk and men think twice about pride. A peasant who yesterday thrust hay with a pitchfork learns quickly the forward step, the low brace, the angle that deflects rather than resists. A spear teaches humility by its very length. It reminds a man to keep distance, to work with companions, to prize steadiness over flourish. Show-offs learn quickly, sometimes too quickly. From spear grows the family of polearms, each with its own appetite. The glaive loves a wide cut from beyond sword's reach. The halberd marries axe to spike and hook, biting at armour, snagging reins, dragging men from saddles with a fisherman's patience. The bill, farm-born, remembers hedges and takes offence at horse and man alike, its beak worrying at gaps and joints. Such tools look ungainly on a wall, but graceful in practised hands. They make a loud argument for the virtue of wood married to steel and of villagers who have learned to hold a line. Agriculture. Still feeding armies, just differently. Shields stand where courage meets caution, the moving doors that let a man step through fear and return. Round, kite-shaped, heater-shaped painted, with colours and beasts that tell friend from foe from afar, they are planks layered and bound, faced with leather or canvas rimmed in iron. They are heavy after a while, the shoulder complains, the forearm burns, yet the shield teaches companionship with pain, and the man who has learned to live under its weight walks more bravely when the arrows fall. On its inner face a strap bears the mark of the hand that sweated there, and sometimes a prayer is scratched where no enemy sees. Motivation posters were yet invented. Mail is its weapon but answer to weapon, a waterfall of rings that flows over the body and turns blade to bruise. The smith who rivets each link knows patience as few do. His work is measured in thousands. Mail sings when lifted and whispers when worn. It drinks oil and returns security. Plate arrives later in pieces fitted like shell to limb and chest, catching daylight like a small sun. Against such harness weapons adapt. Points become more triangular and narrow, hammers sprout beaks, maces grow knobs like a cluster of iron fruit. Each blow invents a counter-blow. War is an argument two craftsmen carry on across men's bodies. As debates go, this one is poorly moderated. The bow is a quiet thing until it speaks. Yew, if one can find it, has heartwood and sapwood that share the work. One compresses, the other stretches, and between them a strength is born that surprises the uninitiated. The bowyer listens to a stave with the knife. He scrapes, he tillers, he bends, he waits. When he strings it, a long, patient curve stands up, like a question about to be asked. The archer answers. Feet set, back straight, draw slow until shoulder and bow agree, breath let out as the fletching touches the cheek, fingers release like a word wisely chosen. The arrow's hiss is brief, but travels farther than many boasts. Boasts, notably, have poor fletching. Arrows are a city of small labours. Shafts need straightening by heat and hand. Feathers must be cut and glued and bound with thread fine but strong. Heads pounded and socketed broad for flesh, bodkin for mail, barbed for the unkind work of making wounds refuse the surgeon's hand. A sheaf of 24 hangs at the archer's side like a promise both to two households, his own, who eat if he is accurate, and his enemies, who pray he is ist. In a battle line, the air becomes a weather of oaken goose, a cloud rises and falls, and men learn how loudly silence can fall in the space after the first volleys land. Forecast, sudden downpour, take cover. Crossbowmen bring a different music. Their bows are short and stubborn, made of layered horn and sinew or of steel. A windlass or goat's foot lever holds the string to its notch. The bolt is stubbier than an arrow, but it has opinions about armour and announces them with authority. The church frowns, says such craft levels noble and churl alike too ruthlessly. Yet towns buy them, princes hire them, and on walls they keep faith where courage alone might falter. A crossbowman knows patience, the long breath while winding, and then the short, sharp release that sends quarrel with a heavy, unromantic certainty toward work. Not pretty, very persuasive. Knives and daggers walk quietly until it is too late to greet them properly. Bacillard, rondelle, misericorde, names like towns whispered quickly. They do the close work in the press, where shields are too wide and swords too long. A small point finds a joint or a visor's slit, a narrow blade, slid beneath ribs, persuades a man to forgive the world. Such tools are not sung of at feasts, but surgeons know their handwriting, and priests know the measure of the sins they tempt. A man may fear a sword, but he distrusts a dagger. Reasonable. Hammers, axes, maces, these are plain words for plain blows. Against harness that laughs at slash and shrugs at shallow thrust, the hammer speaks bluntly to bone, the mace leans like a miller into its work, the axe wedges the iron door and pries it open. There is satisfaction in such strikes for those who love clarity. There is horror in them for those who cannot bear to hear metal complain. The arm that wields them learns a different time than the swordsman's quicksilver, a gathering of weight, a descent like a verdict, a recovery that must be watched lest overreach betray the wrist. Timing, the difference between hero and hazard. Then the engines tall as houses, awkward as oxens, patient as monks. The ballista is a great crossbow with a giant's whim, hurling spears that fly like angry geese. The mangonel twists rope and wood together into a fist that throws stones into roofs. The trebuchet, king of levers, rides weight against distance and tosses boulders as a farmer tosses apples. They arrive with carpenters and ropes and curses. They eat timber as an army eats bread, and they find their voice slowly, with trial shots that test the temper of walls. When stones begin to drum, towns kneel a little in their cellars and learn their own strength anew. Neighborhood Watch has notes. Behind each engine stands a forest cut into parts. Great beams groan, wedges sing, mallets bruise shoulders. Pegs are driven home with thumps that carry to besieged ears as the first heartbeat of dread. Slingers and winchmen brown in sun. A clerk with chalk marks degrees on a timber upright. A captain counts the breaths between release and strike and adjusts, like a cook correcting a stew by taste alone. The hurled stone does not argue, it simply arrives, a round syllable that ends a sentence abruptly in dust, punctuation, but louder. Siege does not live by stone alone. Sappers root at the foot of walls with picks and the discipline of moles, tunneling under towers, propping voids with timbers, then firing them so masonry settles into its own grave. Inside, the defenders listen with their feet for the sound of men in earth, the faint subsong of danger. They dig counter-tunnels, meet the invaders in cramped ground with short blades and shorter breath. Above, archers fire at pavise and mantlet. Below, men fight by touch and cough smoke, until eyes water and resolve stings with it. Everyone suddenly appreciates fresh air. Fire is the oldest ally, and the most capricious. Pitchpots splatter and stick, flaming bolts right brief, wandering lines in the night, straw bundles torch the dry parts of wooden works. Oil takes the suggestion and makes it command. But wind is a prince with no treaty. It will betray attacker or defender as it pleases. A spark makes its career across thatch, quicker than a rumour in a market. A bucket chain of sweating men mutters the psalm that knows all valleys, while passing hope from hand to hand. At dawn, black tongues of smoke write grammar no scholar envies along the sky. Spelling catastrophic. Between great matters there are the small tools without which the great are mute. Straps hold harness to muscle, and wheel to axle. Rivets bind plates, and hinges obey them. Awls pierce, needles bind, wax seals resin clings, pitch tightens seams, tar makes a boat more faithworthy. Rope is everywhere, wound, knotted, looped, singing under strain or purring under palm. Men speak to rope as to a mule, coaxing, cursing, thanking. Without these quiet things, swords would be sticks, and engines would be prayers without candles. Logistics, the real hero again. A soldier's kit is a litany. Spare cord, whetstone, needle and thread, waxed thong, drinking skin, a twist of salt, a bit of soap hardened like a virtue too seldom used, a rag that has been a bandage before and will be again. He carries also what cannot be seen, his mother's blessing, stitched inside his jerkin, a saint's badge on a thong, a token from a wife or girl, bound to the hilt like a small standard no lord conferred. Weapons answer to these as much as to training. Men hold longer for love than for fear. Fear has poor endurance. In camp, the language of weapons shifts from clangor to caretaker's speech. A man sits cross-legged with a stone and draws the blade along it, not hurried, not slow, listening with his fingers for the burr's surrender. Another rubs oil into mail until links drink and shine, checking for weak rivets with the blind reading of habit. Bows are unstrung after rain, braced before dawn. Strings are waxed, arrows counted, fletchings smoothed with a thumbnail. A spearhead is checked for looseness. A lance's grip is re-wrapped where sweat has made honesty of leather. These are the chores of survival disguised as devotion. To-do list, unglamorous, life-saving. When battle joins, weapons write their signatures on air. Lances crack like dry trees. Arrows whisper like a field of grain shaken by a sudden wind. Swords ring, dull at first and then flatter as edges nick and chip. Maces thud like doors shut hard. Axes chop a rhythm that is never dance. Men cry out, not always words. Horses scream in a way that makes the heart mislay itself for a moment. Shields thump, stones roar. Sound becomes a weather that no ear escapes, and through it the body learns what the mind cannot parse, where to turn, when to lift, which way the line leans. The forecast remains complicated. Strategy belongs to captains, instinct belongs to weapons. In a crush, a dagger finds work. On a flank, the spear earns its bread. When the ground is a soup it was not in morning, the man with a short axe keeps his feet, while the long blade tangles. On a slope, arrows learn humility. In a lane, horsemen curse their taller pride. In a sunken road, pikes discover they are too many brothers and not enough space. The art lies in marrying tool to hour, iron to earth, courage to place. Compaditacy matters. Weapons have manners, and their absence tells on a man. A sword raised too high hangs the arm and opens ribs. A shield carried too low makes faith in one's legs carry more than it should. A spear gripped too far back gives the enemy an invitation he will understand. The trained hand wastes nothing, not motion, not breath, not hatred. Hatred cheapens and makes sloppiness. Professionalism, though no minstrel sings of it, keeps men alive who otherwise would have fed crows. Unpopular virtue, competence. There is a sacrilege in weapons no one speaks of, and everyone knows the moment when a tool ceases to answer command and becomes a hunger. A man who loves the hit more than the right, hits harder and then wrong. He lifts again when lifting is no longer required by honor. Priests and captains watch for that bright, ugly fever. After battle, confessions are heard under trees whose bark remembers nails from other wars. A sword lies across two knees, and a man explains to God at length why his edge went where it did. The steel is silent. It will be silent in any hand. Conscience must do the speaking. Sharp edges, dull excuses. After the roar, quiet labour returns with its solemn face. Blades are washed not only of blood but of salt. Oil follows. Linen wipes again. Nicks are counted. Stories are told around each one as if to justify them. Broken shafts are stacked for fire. Good heads are collected for new poles. Arrows are plucked from ground and bodies alike, reusable in the unromantic economy of war. A bow with a lifted splinter is bound and set aside with a sigh. A crossbow string broken at a bad hour is replaced with a muttered thanks that the hour was survived. Repair is the truest brother of battle, and the most underpaid. The dead are inventory too, and this is one of war's colder truths. Harnesses stripped, sometimes with reverence, sometimes without. The good pieces will serve again upon another man's bone. A captured engine is a prize worth more than a banner. It is disassembled with carpenter's care, as if undoing a spell. The field is gleaned like stubble after harvest bolts, arrows, buckles, knives, horseshoes pried from hoof. Scavengers know the value of iron, and so do lords. There is little waste where metal has spoken. Recycling, medieval edition. Weapons live in stories when they are not in hands. A sword earns a name not by length, but by the hour. It was where it must be. A spear is remembered because its bearer set it once, and did not let it slip. A bow is praised because its owner's eye held steady when the sky darkened with others' arrows. A mace wins a poor nickname whispered with grim respect, the bell, because it rang so many helms. An axe is called plough, because it turned so much soil that day where men lay. Such christenings are a way of moving guilt off the shoulders and onto the iron. It is wise, but it is human. Blame the tool classic. The piece that follows learns to live with the tools that built it. A spearhead finds its way to a cottage and becomes a hay-knife. A broken sword is ground into scythes. A bent crossbow stirrup becomes a door hinge in a poor street where metal is precious. Mail links are cut and stitched into mitts for a smith who works near flames. A shield's painted board faces a chicken coop until rain eats the lion from it. War's furniture returns to housekeeping, and the world grows a little easier because iron remembers many shapes. Upcycling before it was trendy. And yet, in the corner of the hall, above the Lord's bench, a good blade hangs, oiled and wrapped, sleeping like a winter seed. It is a reminder and a threat both, a story with its mouth closed. Children glance up at it while passing trenches. The old eye it too, measuring themselves against weights they no longer lift. The steward dusts it with a care that borders on devout. For everyone knows peace is it a dismissal of weapons but a truce with them, a compact that their voices will not be required today, terms subject to sudden revision. So the weapons of war are not monsters born from rage, they are crafts for which men prayed before using. They are the proof that earth gives o iron, and men give o sleep to shape it. They are arguments hammered thin and then thick again. They are the edge between courage and cruelty, drawn new each morning by the hand that lifts them. In their presence, the heart learns its balance, to be quick without haste, strong without hardness, exact without pride. And when the curfew bell of battle at last is rung, when drums fall silent and the watch takes up its slower pace, same hands that swung and thrust and loosed turn again to oil, to whetstone, to the small faithful chores by which tomorrow's mercy is prepared. Maintenance, the quiet miracle. Before war clanged upon the field, it settled first upon bodies and stones. Armour was a house worn on the skin. Walls were armour worn by a land. Between these two, man sheathed and the place encircled, lay the art of not dying, the quiet craft of resisting ruin. Knights learned to carry their defences with them. Masons taught towns how to make defences stand when men fell. And always, beneath metal and mortar, there was cloth and timber, leather and rope, humble things that bore the brunt long before glory arrived. Glory is famously late to work. A man's first armour was not iron, but linen. The gambeson, a quilted coat stitched of many layers, hugged the body tied snug beneath arm and throat. It smelled of sweat and tallow, and the soap that never quite drove them out. It creaked faintly where stitches strained. It warmed in winter and baked in summer. Yet it did more than soften a blow. It spread force, took edges, protected skin from iron's ill temper. To put on a gambeson was to remember that softness to stand between hardness and harm. A rare victory for padded. Over it flowed mail, a river of rings. Link by link, thousands upon thousands, a craftsman with sore eyes and steady wrists had riveted them into a fabric that draped like cloth and weighed like honesty. Mail drank oil and whispered when lifted. It pooled around the hips like a sigh and hugged the shoulders as if it meant to be a friend. It did not despise the thrust, but it preferred the cut. It turned blades to bruises and reminded the man within that every protection demands a tax of fatigue. When the day's work was over, Mail came off with a grunted blessing, and hands smelled of iron until morning. Cologne. Essence of forge. Helms evolved as men learned where death likes to knock. First a simple iron cap, then a nasal bar to fend the blade that seeks the nose, then the great helm, a barrel for the head with eyes set in narrow, suspicious slits. It made men look like walking shrines, square, solemn, formidable, and it rang when struck with a dull music that only the wearer heard too loudly. Later, the helm grew a face, the bassinet with its pointed crown and the visor that could be raised for air and lowered for argument. An aventail of mail fell from its brow like a veil of iron. Underneath was a padded cap, and under that the skull itself, and under that the thoughts that ought to be kept clear. Armor remembered that a man is more than his bone. It guarded the place where prayer lives, also the place where plans live, ideally good ones. Plate arrived like a new grammar-shaped pieces, tailored by hammer and heat to shins and thighs, to forearm and upper arm, to chest and shoulder. The cuirass cupped the ribs and sternum, pauldrons grew wings to turn edges aside from the neck, vambraces and gauntlets articulated like crab and beetle, a mechanical miracle that let fingers grip and wrists flex. At knees, pollens bloomed with wings that guarded joint and tendon. At elbows, kudas flared, a petal of defense in a garden of threat. The armor-smith measured a man not only in inches but in habits, how he leaned, how he favored one leg where his shoulder rounded from long bows or long hammers. Iron, persuaded, took those measures and learned to move like a second body. Tailoring, but louder. Beneath each plate were points laces that tied leather to eyelets, twined through with a squire's care until nothing shifted but what should. An arming doublet fitted close, pierced at the right places. There was a joy in aligning hole to hole and finding the knot's memory from yesterday. Armor was not thrown on, it was worn like a vow. Two men dressed one. The rhythm of it became prayerful. Lift, settle, tie, test, nod. The last piece was the glove. When fingers slid into their iron shells and leather-kissed palm, the world narrowed to grip and sight, to breath and oath. Snap, clack, promise. Not all who travelled the road to danger could afford iron's entire wardrobe. Many a footman went in gambeson alone, or with a sleeveless jack studded with small plates sewn underneath the poor man's plate, called brigandine. Others tied splints, long iron laths, along calf or forearm beneath leather. A hammered kettle hat shaded the face and turned blows like a roof turns rain. A simple heater shield bore a painted cross, or simple colour when nobler men boasted beasts. Chipped, smoke-stained, the board still stood between heart and harm. In such gear men learned that defence is often patchwork and good enough. Perfection is expensive. Survival is practical. Armour needed more than oil, it needed wisdom. A shield lifted too late tires faster than a shield lifted early. A visor closed too soon steals breath that a man will want. Mail hung too long at the hem grabs a knee in mud and teaches humility without mercy. The trained learned how to rest while ready, how to find ease in bearing, how to let the weight sit on bone and not on muscle. A man in harness learns honesty about where he begins and ends. He knows his own width at doorways, his own height under beams, his own stamina under sun. Iron measures truth in sweat, and posts the results without flattery. If armour was a moving house, walls were a settled suit. Fortresses began in earth. The quickest defence a frightened valley can make is a bank throw our soil, pile it high, cut a ditch before it, set a palisade on top, sharp stakes, interlaced and bound. A ringwork or motte rose like an artificial hill with a wooden tower on its crown. Such work went up in a season, if hands were many and fear generous. It served against raider and quarrelsome neighbour, and it gave peasants a place to run when hooves shook the road. Wood burns, yes, but it also builds faster than stone, and sometimes speed is the true shield, delivery within one campaign season. Stone came when memory learned that enemies return. Curtain walls traced the hills back like a sleeping dragon. Towers stood at intervals to see farther and shoot wider. A keep rose in the centre, a house of last resort where bread and hope were stored tight as secrets. The gatehouse became a mouth with teeth. Portcullis of iron or oak shod with iron, murder holes in the ceiling, arrow loops in flanking walls. Over the walkway, carpenters hung hoardings, timber galleries that let defenders rain arrows and stones straight down. Where timber feared flame, masons raised matriculations. Stone jaws that bit empty air and fed enemies with falling rock, open wide. A wall is more than height. It is thickness, angle, footing, and the way it talks to the land. Good masons bend stone to hill and stream. They find rock that remembers pressure without sulking. They face outer courses smooth to shrug ladders, and inner courses rough, so lime clutches well. They build buttresses where weight runs anxious, batter the base outward so rams glance off, lay string courses that force a sapper's tunnel to stumble. The craft is patient. A tower plumb to the eye could be wicked to a ram simply by having its heart set at a trick angle. Stone answers in centuries what wood answers in months. Customer service, very long hold music. Around the base, a moat made arguments that armour could not. Where water could be borrowed from river or mill stream, it gleamed and stank by seasons. Frog song and reed rustle in summer, black ice in winter. A herbal smell of rot that bred mosquitoes and discouraged close inspection. Where water refused, a dry ditch did the work with honest depth and treacherous sides. Stakes or hidden pits made the descent foolish and the climb worse. Bridges of timber drew up or swung aside. A man on the far bank learned patience abruptly when the plank retreated like a sentence recalled mid-speech. Edit, access denied. Gate discipline was the daily liturgy of defence. Dawn opened, dusk closed. Strangers were asked their business and the name of someone who could vouch. Carts were searched with poles that prodded hay, where thieves and worse crouch. Pigs squealed whenever sticks found them, and so did hidden men. The warden kept a book in his head, which face came daily, which rarely, who owed coin, who drank too much, who looked over his shoulder at the wrong moment. A good gatekeeper saved more lives than a dozen heroes. He kept danger from needing iron's opinion. Front desk, crucial. Towns learned to be fortresses that traded in peace. Stone walls traced their growth like tree rings. The burghers' wealth paid masons and mortar. Watchtowers rose at corners like thickened punctuation. Barbicans thrust outward from gates like clenched fists. Within, streets bent in doglegs that confounded a charge and made ambush easier for friends than for foes. Gates did not face each other, lest a ram could stare through one to the next. Wells were covered, granaries guarded, bastions placed where they could look across each other's shoulders. A town that has been burned learns to love geometry. Right angles, fewer wrong turns. Villages lacked stone but not sense. When rumour reached them, men cut thorn and stacked brush walls around the green. Carts were heaped to make wagonbergs, wheels locked and axles braced, a ring of stubborn wood with spear points bristling between spokes. The church, thick-walled, small-windowed, served as last shelter. Bells rang, not for mass alone, but for gathering. Women hauled stones to upper windows, children fetched water, old men sat with bows and remembered how to breathe between shots. Defence is a communal verb. Even fear can be marshalled. Teamwork, suddenly very popular. Monasteries, set apart for prayer, learned caution from thieves who loved quiet cloisters more than loud markets. They raised walls, not to keep God in, but to keep wolves out. Four-legged, two-legged, and the kind that carry torches. Gates were small, guest halls stood near them so hospitality could be honest and prudent at once. Granaries were stout. Libraries often had doors heavier than the treasure room, for a book is harder to replace than gold. In towers, a monk kept not only lamps but also a beacon laid ready for high wind, a basket of pitch or a stack of faggots, part of a chain of signal fires that ran along the spine of hills. Why fire? Beacons stitched land to land. One flare on a western ridge became two on the next, then 4, then 20. A red sentence racing where hooves cannot. Shepherds watched by day for the laid wood. By night, the glow meant gather, hide, pray, or run. A child who had seen a beacon knew what a nation feels like for the first tithe. Not a king's court or a bishop's map, but a string of hills that to speak to each other in flame. Coverage surprisingly good. Inside a siege, defence changed from stones to stomachs. The rationer counted loaves and issues of grain, kept barley for beasts and wheat for men, cut cheese thinner than pride liked. The well became a saint. Every bucket was a pilgrimage. Wood for cook fires shrank to embers for soup, then to twigs for broth of hope. Men slept by the wall in shifts. Women took turns at ovens left cold more hours than they burned. Children learned not to cry at night, because sound travels upward to engines as surely as stones travel downward from them. Silence. Suddenly strategic. On the ramparts, craft met craft. Arrow loops narrowed inside to give shooters a fan of sight. Crossbowmen leaned elbows on oak and let quarrels carry the argument. Stones lay in neat piles behind crenels. The best throwers were strong women with a knack for timing. Boiling water was kinder than oil. A poor house cannot spare oil for hatred. Heated sand poured through gaps, slid into visor slit and glove cuff alike, burning where water does not reach. A log, swung on chains, knocked ladders free so men fell like beads broken off a string. When flames licked hoardings, men with wet cloths and hook poles fought the fire like a living thief. Firefighting, medieval edition. Defenders sallied when pride and prudence agreed. A postern opened like an eye. A handful of men rushed out in a short, savage dash to burn a tower, cut a rope, seize a banner, drag back a prisoner whose tongue could be mined for plans. Then back, quick as a swallow to eve, door slammed, bar dropped, breathing hard with the dangerous joy of having been briefly larger than walls. Such darts of courage feed a garrison for a week. Morale topped up. In the counting houses of lords, defence had another face. Levies and tallage to pay for mortar and men. Corvée days when peasants repaired ditches, shored banks, lugged stone. Watch rotations posted on doors, names chalked under nights that must be walked. Defence is not only drama, it is schedule and sore backs. A wise lord bore some part himself, went atop walls, spoke to masons by name, bought good lime, paid on tie, because a wall built grudgingly falls early. Budget line, absolutely necessary. On the road, defence was not height but formation. Men with shields overlapped into a moving wall. Pikes stood like a winter field, bristling with stubble too stiff for hooves. Archers hid behind stakes slanted like a bristling boar. Horsemen guarded wings or waited to punish pride that broke itself on spear thicket. When the chevauchée scorched ride came through, burning barns and trampling grain, villagers practiced the only defence that stands against fire. Remove what can be carried, hide what cannot, and live to plant again, insurance not included. Roads themselves made armour when watched well, bridges with gatehouses choked and marched to a trickle. Fords with rocks set cunningly forced horse to pick away, with head bent and pride briefly humbled. Defiles, narrow places where hill presses river, became mills where impatience is ground into losses. A small redoubt of timber at a bend in the lane, a ditch dug across a likely field, a wall of carts backed tight, a hedge laid thick with thorns. These were lesser plates that turned aside greater blows. Travel advisory delayed. It is easy to admire the bright of armour and the clean line of a wall. It is harder to love their costs. A village that sends men to move stone cannot bring hay in as swiftly. A household that buys a helm leaves a debt that gnaws through winter. The tax for walls is paid in loaves that are not baked and shoes that are not mended. Yet fear counts too, and surviving has its math. People learn to balance one more day on the ditch, one less at the plough, one more penny to the mason, one less to the tavern. Peace is dearer than ale, even good ale. When siege ends by storm, negotiation, famine, or simply the boredom that dissolves armies, work of defence scabs over. Stones are reset, new wood replaces blackened, lime dries pale as bone, then weathers to gentler shades. The wall remembers but does not speak. Armour is mended, dents are hammered into stories, broken rings are replaced by a squire who now knows exactly how much patience weighs. A woman washes a gambeson with fuller's earth until stains become ghosts. A boy, too young to have stood yet, counts arrowheads and dreams bigger than his shoes, ambition currently oversized. In quieter years, walls become walks for lovers. Towers hold doves as readily as lookouts. The keep's cold storerooms smell again of apple and smoked meat instead of fear. Children play at siege with sticks and songs, and their laughter runs bright along parapets meant to hear groans. Armour is brought out for processions and hung with garlands. Dents that once meant death to someone are touched lightly by curious hands. Defence, resting, becomes ornament. It is a mercy when such rest is long. Please let it be long. Yet the craft remains, like a psalm remembered even by those who have not sung it lately. Smiths keep the rivet tools oiled, masons send boys to fetch good sand from the bend in the river where grains pack tight. Wardens update their lists. The beacon wood is turned so it does not rot. Hinges are greased on gates that may never need to shut in anger again. This is it dread, it is discipline. The world is a house that we hope will stand. One keeps the roof mended even when the sky is blue. Optimism with a toolkit. Armour and defences are our emblems of fear alone. They are the courtesy that strength pays to life. Acknowledgement that breath is worth guarding, that bread is worth sheltering, that children are worth the thickness of stone and the tiredness of shoulders. A man in harness does not despise the body within, he honours it with care. A town behind walls does not scorn the fields without, it learns to love them more tenderly for being defended. Security, deposit, refundable in peace. And so, when evening came to the castle or the town, and the gate was barred with a bar that had seen many hands, and the watch took their lanterns and walked their circles, and a knight set his helm upon a peg whose dent matched the dent in his memory, defence exhaled. The stars looked kindly on stones and iron both. Within, bread was broken. Without, foxes skirted moats and found other paths. The beacon slept. Night washed over walls and mail like water over rock. And in the morning, the sun showed mortar lines and ringed links, and knew them for what they were. Patient answers to a world that sometimes shouts. Replies sent, inbox closed till dawn. A castle at peace is a house with deep pockets and high views. A castle in siege is a chest whose lid is pressed by many hands, whose contents rattle, whose hinges complain. When banners appeared on the far ridge and dust stood in pillars above the road, when scouts came back with faces tight and tongues brief, the lord and steward did not argue about what it meant. The bell was rung, the outer fields were called empty, flocks drove in, the last carts creaked under sacks that smelled of grain and fear. The gate closed not with ceremony but with haste, the bar dropped like a sentence finished too soon. Inside, the world reshaped itself in an afternoon. The yard that yesterday hosted games became an armory floor. The bakehouse counted loaves as soldiers rather than as suppers. The wellhead grew a rope-worn lip within a day. The steward paced with a tally in his palm. So many mouths, so many days' oats, so much salted meat, so much cheese. How many candles, how much oil, how much patience. The chaplain set lights before the Virgin and sorted the litany for storm and famine. Women hauled, children fetched, old men who had set stones when the curtain wall was young came and put their hands on her, as if greeting an aged friend called back into duty. Without, the besiegers made their own village. Tents sprouted in rings, fires kindled in ordered rows, pickets driven. The engines arrived like ungainly pilgrims, their ribs showing, their arms limp, to be assembled by men who swore affectionately, and hit timbers as if they could persuade them to remember last year's victories. Carts dumped stones until the field looked sown with white fruit. The first measuring was done, paces taken, angles judged, the place where the wall bowed a little noted, the place where a tower sat on a seam of softer soil marked with a smile. War is carpentry before it is courage. The first day's missiles were more message than murder. Stones thudded and skittered. A few roof tiles leapt like startled birds. A beam in a stable complained and would later be thanked for not breaking. Arrows came up in testing arcs. A quarrel smacked into a shutter and stayed there quivering like an accusation. The castle answered with shots of its own, bolts that hummed with anger, arrows that arced with grace, stones that tumbled end over end to scatter fascinated men who had come too close to watch. Both sides learned each other's breath. The garrison spread along the wall by habit, not panic. A captain marked each crenel with a name. The keen-eyed were given loops with widest vista. The steady were set where ladders might come. The hot-blooded were posted near the postern for sudden errands. A woman with strong arms and a temper like good yeast took charge of the stone piles, rationing them like bread. Boys ran messages the way swallows stitch air, fear made quick by usefulness. Below, the kitchens measured wood and the rationer dealt out flour in handfuls that hurt to look at. The well was guarded as if it were the Lord's heir. At dusk of the second day, rams came forward behind mantlets. Big ox-hide shields hung on wheels that whined. The ram's head wore iron, a bull with more stubbornness than beauty. It began to speak to the gate with a hollow thud that ran through wood into bone. Above, men with hook poles leaned out and tried to bite the mantlets and pull them aside. Others dropped rocks that sounded like punctuation marks upon the roof of hides. A pot poured sand heated to anger. The men beneath the hides shifted and cursed and kept rhythm. A ram is a drum. The castle learned its beat. Sappers began to scratch at a tower's foot, where the mason's seams were older and perhaps less devout. They built a shed of planks and rawhide to crouch under. Smoke from their cooking fires had a guilty smell. Inside, pick met mortar, pick met stone, pick learned patience. They shored the eating out with timbers, dry and eager. The defenders, wise to such hunger, put their ears to the floor of the gallery and listened. There is a song to men burrowing. It travels in stone better than words. A counter-tunnel began, dug by men who did not fear the dark if it meant light for their children. Pits met pits, curses met curses. Short blades met in a ground that felt like a grave the two had agreed to share. Days took on a weather of their own. Dawn was arrows, noon was stones, evening was fire. At night both sides sang to keep courage awake and to pretend to the other that sleep was not desired. Inside, 2 loaves were baked for every 3 that wanted one. Meat grew stringy with repetition and stories of its former self. A child asked why the cheese was thinner. A woman told him the Virgin had asked for a longer prayer between bites. Thirst taught economy. Men learned to drink in swallows, to swill the mouth before the throat, to bless water as if it were wine. A messenger was let slip one night. clambering like a spider down the scarp where ivy made a ladder that stung. He carried letters sewn inside his cap, written in a hand that shook but did not blot, promising endurance, asking for succour, naming dates and dwindling sacks. He wore no iron, speed was his harness. He reached the ditch, crossed it where carts had muddied a ford, slid through a hedge with thorns that told him truths about patience, and ran like a hare toward a town that might listen. Inside, the garrison prayed for his feet as if they were relics. Parley came on the fourth morning, because thirst of blood has its courtesies. A herald in a coat with checks like a chessboard walked to the ditch and asked for words. The lord and the chaplain stood over the gate in their best patience. Terms were read: surrender with honours, safe conduct to leave with personal goods, or else no quarter when the ladder reached the parapet. The lord asked for tide to write to his liege. The herald was polite and said his master could read urgency without letters. Eyes were cool, voices steady. Everyone watched the wind, which is always the truest judged. Refusal stiffened everything. The engines spoke in earnest now. Their stones came not singly but like flocks, their shadows chasing each other over roofs and yards. The hoardings shook, then sagged, then fed the fire as the attacker's bolts found tar with the ease of a sin-finding habit. Men with wet hides and hooks fought flame as if it were a rogue cousin, knowing its tricks and shouting at it in the old family tongue. A beam fell and made a punctuation mark too large for grammar. Dust rose like a sudden fog, tasted of lime and mouse nests. In the chapel, the chaplain's voice didn't rise. He read as if the psalm were a road and he must simply keep walking. A sally was decided, because standing only is a way of dying. Before dawn, when the camp's fires were sighing and men are most like children again, the postern opened and a handful went out, picked for speed, for quiet, for liking each other in a way that makes men quick. They ran not at the tents but at the nearest engine, that proud trebuchet nicknamed by its keepers as if it were a beloved mule. Torches licked its ropes, axes kissed its legs. A man with a knife like good news cut the sling. Shouts rose as from a bed where a bad dream has turned true. They fled then, as quickly, with 2 wounded carried like debts you intend to pay. Behind them, the engine stood oddly, like a crane whose fish had decided to argue. Both sides cheered in the same breath for different reasons. Siege teaches people their parts. The mason became soldier with mallet. The miller counted sacks like a bishop counts souls. The laundress learned to bind wounds tighter than tears. The lord fetched stones himself when pride could not lift them fast enough. The cellarer guarded a last cask as if it were a saint who disliked a crowd. A boy grew into his feet in a week. A girl learned where to aim a pot so it falls where ladder meets wall. The old told stories between flights of arrows about sieges they had heard of when they were young, and in the telling kept breath, even and hands steady. Sickness entered as it does when strangers crowd and water is precious. A cough took a row of beds, a fever made eyes glassy. A sourness of the bowels taught humility. The herbal woman worked in a corner with mint, rue, and hope. The chaplain carried the oil that comforts dying. The steward allocated clean straw as if it were coin. The garrison learned to blaspheme less and wash more where water allowed. Death made a small procession at dusk when arrows were quietest. The dead were lowered from the wall on ropes to a dry ditch within, covered with earth that had earlier been an old garden. Promises were made to do better by them when God allowed. One noon, the sapper's fire took, and a corner of a tower settled into itself, with a groan that men felt in their teeth. The wall opened not in a grand arch, but in a jagged mouth. Horns blew, drums hurried men, ladders moved on shoulders, shields lifted. The air filled with rocks, wood, bolts, curses. The breach was the world for the span of a life. Men met their elbows and eyes, heavy with iron and as light as birds with fear. Blades worked where there was no room to swing. Knees became weapons, teeth had their own brief war. A red wet grew underfoot that made everything either slippery or sticky, and both are enemies to poise. The defenders had kept 2 carts ready with stones, their wheels chocked. Now they went forward like stubborn oxes and tipped their bellies down the slope of the broken wall, a river of rubble that made a new rampart out of ruin. Behind it, shields nested. Spears bristled over the ridge like the first wheat in spring. The chaplain stood there too, not with sword but with water and words, and a look that said both would be given where needed. The attackers fell back a dozen paces and tried again, as men do. The second meeting was shorter. The third held until both sides decided that breath is more precious than pride before sunset. Night was bargaining time. Fires sprang up in the besiegers' ring like a second constellation. Inside, every candle was spared, unless it was needful for stitching or dyeing. The Lord convened his captains. The stewards spread the grim table of numbers. They counted like misers and saints both. If help would come in 2 days, could bread last 3? If water must be drawn at half buckets, could the men on the south wall still sing? If a sally tomorrow ruined the ram, would the breach hold until marvels arrived? Calculation is the rope men cross chasms on when they cannot fly. Dawn brought a banner new to the ridge, and a murmur that grows legs. The messenger had earned his bread. A relief force showed its colours like flowers. The valley thought lost to frost. The besiegers turned part of their face that way, and the castle breathed an eighth of a lungful. Yet no gate swung wide, no fool rushed. The day became a plaited rope of skirmish and shot, of feint and answer. In the afternoon a storm came in like a bishop who will brook no nonsense. Rain drummed tents to humility, soaked bowstrings, cooled stones, made the breach a slide of sincerity. Both sides thanked God for the pause and pretended to have planned it. When battles met beyond the ditch, the castle watched like a man at a window whose sons dispute in the yard. The field glittered with moving drops. Horses sprayed mud and light. Cries surged and broke, standards tilted like wind-bent trees, and righted with an obstinacy that made old men nod. Inside, women stood on stools to see over parapets, then turned away to stir pots and to bind a boy's scraped hand, because glory is a good cloak but a poor bandage. At evening, the relief held the ridge, the besiegers held the ditch, and the castle held its breath again until night made everyone honest. Some sieges end with bravery, many end with bargain. At last the herald came once more, and the Lord listened with eyes that had measured his well against the sky. Terms were kinder now that help gleamed on the horizon. The garrison would march out with arms and honour. The poor would remain. The church would not be burned. The granary would be inventoried under 2 seals. The Lord would be exchanged, like a promise, for one of equal weight in another hall. The chaplain watched both faces and nodded once. Pride is a good horse. It must be reined before it throws the rider. The gate opened at noon the next day, because noon is a tie that insults neither side. Men filed out 2 by 2, helmets bright where they had been rubbed, dents worn like medals, hunger disguised by posture. Women followed with bundles, children stumbled, holding bread that had been saved for this very walk. The besiegers stood aside, curious and silent. They saw their own faces on these others, smeared with the same mud, drawn by the same knights. A drum rolled softly, as if not to wake those who had stayed behind forever. Afterwards the castle had to learn the art of breath again. Ashes were swept, beams propped. A mason climbed with line and weight and said where to put the first stone of healing. The well rope was replaced. The bakehouse smelled of bread without the taste of fear. The chapel's candles burned as prayer rather than as policy. Names were said, with tears and with relief both. A child counted the fallen arrows as if they were shells by a summer sea. A woman washed a gambeson until the water turned the colour of old stories. The steward slept, and for a night did not count. Years later, when peace sat in the yard like an old dog, content to be scratched, someone would point to a patched seam in the wall and tell the tale of the daystone flowed like water, and courage like wine. The breach would be a bench for lovers. The postern would be a place where boys dared each other to stand. After dark, the well would be complimented like an aunt who had lent more than she could bear, but the memory would keep its teeth. When clouds built strange on the far ridge, when horsemen on the road looked too many for market, when a raven sat too long on the gatehouse cross, hands would know where to go without being told. A castle in siege is a society learning itself at speed, what it will share, what it will spare, where it will bend, where it will break. Stones teach patience, iron teaches honesty, hunger teaches mercy, songs teach stubbornness, prayer teaches all of these to sit at table together. In the end, whether the gate holds or yields, the true walls are the habits that kept fear at heel for one more hour. And when night fell on the last day and the lanterns walked the parapets in their slow constellations, the castle lifted its face to the same stars as the camp beyond. Both asked for sleep. Both, for a while, received it. An army on the move was more than knights in glittering harness. It was a walking town, a restless city that carried its own market, its own court, its own refuse, its own prayers. Where it halted, fields became streets, hedgerows became boundaries, fires made neighbourhoods, and the air thickened with smoke, sweat, horse breath, and anticipation. To muster was to summon not only warriors but the whole scaffolding of life that clung to them, as ivy clings to stone. City planning, but with more mud and opinions. The gathering began with summons proclamations read on market days, sealed letters borne by messengers, a lord's voice echoing in a hall. Men came in small knots, from hamlet and manor, bearing what arms they had. A spear polished at its point by honest hay before, now bound with new iron. A shield painted quickly with lime and lampblack. A leather cap hammered straight after being bent in some childhood accident. They brought bundles of bread, skins of ale, knives meant for both camp and fight. Some led ox or horses, some brought carts with squealing wheels, some carried everything on backs not yet grown used to such weight. The muster yard became a catalogue of a region's strength and poverty both. Inventory, impressive, warranties, none. At the mustering ground, names were called as in church, each man stepping forward to be seen, to nod, to swear, to take his place in the roll. Captains marked them with chalk or ink, sometimes with memory alone. A young man flushed when his name was missed, because in such a crowd a mission felt like a theft of self. He demanded to be written, and the scribe obeyed with an arched brow. Men sorted themselves into hundreds and tens, into retinues that shared a lord, into bands that shared a dialect. Familiar faces grouped, strangers looked sideways, measuring future trust. Team-building exercise, unavoidable. Craftsmen came with them, for war eats more than courage. The smith carried his anvil head in a cart, swearing at its weight but swearing worse when it was late. The fletcher bore a chest of half-made shafts, feathers bundled like geese in flight. The cook trundled pots blackened with older wars more precious than silver because they turn grain and water into fuel. The armourer shouted for space to pitch his tent, for he knew before battle he would be asked to patch half the host. A few women walked with them, wives, laundresses, herb wives, faces set in lines that meant no one would move them now. Logistics, the eternal appetite. When the army camped, it unfolded itself like cloth. Stakes went into ground with a rhythm older than speech, ropes stretched, hides and linen flapped up into shelter. Knights raised coloured tents, striped or checkered, their pennons fluttering like impatient hands. Common men leaned poles together and threw cloaks or wattled hurdles over them. Horses were staked, lines drawn between carts, fires struck with flint and tinder. Within an hour, an empty field smelled of roasting, of leather, of dung, of smoke, of men settling into order. Air now fortified with essence of campaign. The camp street was a thing of improvisation and memory both. Paths worn between tents became lanes. The well or the stream became a square. A chapel tent with its cross stood at the centre, and men touched caps when passing. Market wagons rolled up even here, selling trinkets, pies, ribbons, dice. Children darted among legs, fetching water for a copper, holding horses for a crumb. Minstrels tuned lutes or fiddles in corners, hoping to earn coin with songs that flattered one side and mocked the other. Every army carries its own economy, because hunger and boredom are as real as the enemy. Supply versus demand draw. Discipline was a fence built daily. A captain walked the rows at dusk, noting fires that burned too high, men who drank too deep, tents pitched too near the latrine trench. Punishments were swift, for an army cannot argue long with itself when danger sits just beyond. A man who stole bread found himself whipped. One who raised knife against a comrade found himself bound. One who left watch for sleep bore shame that clung heavier than chains. Yet within those bounds, laughter was loud, dice clattered, boasts were born and pricked, and friendship hardened like iron quenched in water. Morale management, firm but fair. The soundscape of a camp was never still. Horses stamped, whinnied, blew through nostrils like bellows. Hammers struck anvils in a heartbeat rhythm that answered drums. Men shouted greetings, called names, swore at stakes and ropes. Over it all the calls of watchmen marked the hours, each cry taken up by the next as a chant of vigilance. At night, the distant crack of an enemy's fire could be heard, and silence fell for a moment as each man measured the nearness of tomorrow. Then consus rose again, softer, as men huddled nearer their own flames. Volume adjustable, never off. The Lord's pavilion stood proud at the camp's heart, taller, painted, sometimes gilded. Within, a table held maps, sheepskin stretched and inked with rivers, hills, names of towns, candles guttered in lanterns that smoked the canvas roof. Captains gathered, voices low, hands stabbing at lines, pebbles standing for companies, cups for cavalry. Outside, guards paced with spears, their faces fixed but ears pricked. Decisions taken within the painted cloth rippled outward through the lanes of tents, until a ploughman knew by dusk whether he would stand in the van or the rear come dawn. Management meeting, minutes not circulated. For the common soldier, the day was measured by drills and chores. Spears were hefted, shields overlapped, bows bent and loosed at straw sacks hung from poles. Men marched in files until their feet learned to ignore stones. They dug ditches to ring the camp, set palisades of sharpened stakes, learned the worth of a barrier that might buy them an hour in the dark. Work kept fear from growing teeth too quickly. Work also gave men stories to tell later, of how they marched in mud to their ankles yet laughed at a jest too coarse to repeat before wives. Work-life balance, mostly work. Night in the camp was a mingling of comfort and dread. Fires ringed the lines, their smoke rising like prayers. Pots bubbled with pottage made of grain and whatever meat the quartermaster had found, sometimes ox, sometimes rabbit, sometimes less welcome fare. Songs rose, ballads of home, drinking catches, prayers set to melody, boasts about girls not yet kissed and foes not yet met. Beyond the circle of flame shadows stretched, and the watch walked with slow steps, their eyes never still. From the dark sometimes came sounds, a fox, a horse shifting, an enemy scout. The boundary between safety and peril was no wider than the glow of a coal. Comfort radius, one campfire. The camp followers were their own small nation. Laundresses boiled clothes until steam rose in ghostly pillars. Sutlers sold wine sourer than vinegar but sweeter than nothing. Whores plied trade, guarded by men who kept knives sharp. Jugglers and storytellers found coin where fear made men generous. Thieves moved too, though careful, for justice in camp could be swift and terminal. Children ran with dogs, learning a soldier's curses before a scholar's letters. War pulls behind it all the occupations of peace, drawn like thread through the needle of necessity. HR department, unofficial, effective. Morning roll call had its own majesty. Drums beat, horns blew, men spilled into lines, faces rough with sleep. Captains called names, men raised hands, muttered here, or stayed silent when sickness had taken voice away. The banner unfurled in the early light, dew shaking from its edge. Prayer followed, led by chaplain or priest, Latin words mumbled into many dialects, ending with a cross traced over faces still marked with ash from the fire. Then orders were read. March, dig, drill, rest. An army is a machine of hours. Its strength lies not only in arms but in rhythm, calendar app, son and sergeant. Sometimes the enemy's camp was visible from a hill. Two cities glared at each other across a valley, two forests of tents, two rings of smoke, two murmuring crowds. At night, men swore they could hear the other side's songs. Sometimes insults were shouted back and forth, rude poems that turned names into jeers. Other times there was silence, which was worse, for it allowed imagination to fatten on dread. The two armies mirrored each other in fear and in hope, each man thinking the same thoughts beneath a different banner. Relatable content, regrettably. Disease was an enemy more patient than any army. Lice bred in seams. Fevers ran from tent to tent, wounds festered, bellies cramped from bad water. The surgeon's tent grew busy, smelling of vinegar, honey, sweat, and herbs. Men whispered of plague, of pestilence that did not carry a sword but struck quicker. The camp learned to dig latrines far and deep, to boil water, to pray harder. Yet still men died in their beds with swords by their sides, victims not of valor but of filth. War and filth are poor neighbors, but neighbors they remain. Hygiene, the unglamorous hero. Yet even amid fear there was festivity. Feast days were marked by mass, by candles, by loaves shared. Lords gave coins for ale, knowing cheer is cheaper than mutiny. Men danced, clapped hands, shouted choruses into the night until laughter drowned dread. A knight might tilt at quintain to show off for squires. A minstrel might spin a tale of Alexander or Roland to remind them that armies have triumphed before. Such moments didn't erase fear. They put it in a chair and poured it a cup until it drank itself smaller. Therapy medieval style. When at last the order came to march, camp folded itself as swiftly as it had sprung. Fires were stamped, ashes scattered, ropes unknotted, carts loaded. The field bore scars, blackened patches where hearths had burned, muddy lines where tents had stood, scraps of straw, bones, broken arrows. Birds descended as soon as men left, scavenging what hunger and haste forgot. The army moved like a beast, long and slow, banners nodding above it, drums and horns setting the pace. Behind, the ground remembered a brief town that had lived, laughed, wept and gone, leaving only ruts and ashes. Checkout type observed. The muster and camp were preludes only. They were battles of their own kind against hunger, boredom, sickness, impatience. Victory here meant an army that still had the strength to fight when the field was reached. A broken camp was as fatal as a broken line in combat. Lords knew this. Sergeants knew this. Even the humblest peasant with a spear learned it. For war is won on the day of clash alone, but in the thousand small labours of tents, fires, names called, horses watered, and bread baked. Operations critical path. And so when night fell again on a camp that seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other, men lay down with the smell of smoke in their hair, the ache of labour in their limbs, the murmur of comrades in their ears. They slept under canvas patched a dozen times, under stars they had forgotten to notice at home, under the weight of both dread and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring orders, tomorrow might bring battle. Tonight was theirs, in this fragile town of rope and cloth, that lived for a heartbeat in the middle of a war. Please dream of home anyway. First summons came with the tolling of the great bell, subtle as a hammer in a wash basin, as ever. Its deep, slow notes rolled across the valley, waking cottagers and shepherds, echoing in the timbered streets of the town. In the fields, men straightened from their work. In the small alehouse, tankards were set down mid-drink, a rare mercy to the table. Everyone knew the meaning. The Lord was calling his levy. The muster of arms would begin at dawn on the green below the castle. That evening was full of quiet stir. In cottages and crofts, fathers took down spears long stored above hearths carefully, as if the cobwebs were official seals. Sons tried on old belts and bent under the weight of dented helmets that had clearly seen action, mostly against cupboards. Wives mended worn gambesons, stuffing extra rags into gaps where padding had thinned, turning yesterday's scraps into today's courage. The blacksmith's forge glowed late, ringing with hurried work as axe heads were tightened and horseshoes replaced. Dogs barked at the clatter, uneasy with the strange mood in the air, then settled when nothing demanded chasing but nerves. No one spoke loudly. Though it was honour to serve, it was also fear. Few in the levy were seasoned men-at-arms. Most were farmers, craftsmen, shepherds, heroes of wheat and wool. Some had fought before, but many had not. They looked at the sky and at their children with a quiet gravity, weighing duty against danger, and finding the scales unhelpfully even. Still, the summons could not be ignored. The law and the bonds of service bound them as tightly as any strap they buckled that night. At first light, the town green filled with men. Some came on foot with staves or spears, others led small nags or sturdy plough horses, who did not remember volunteering. A few better-off yeomen bore swords or crossbows. Most wore rough padded jacks or thick wool, with helms of iron or leather, fashionable if one's taste ran to weatherproof bucket. They gathered in clusters, cousins together, neighbours murmuring, guildsmen helping each other strap on mismatched bits of mail. Women and children followed, carrying bundles and watching with solemn eyes that knew more than they said. The steward of the castle rode down early to take account. He was a stern man, mounted on a grey horse, with a clerk beside him holding a roll of names and an expression learned from long acquaintance with spelling. As each man presented himself, the clerk marked the tally. Weapons were inspected. A bent spear might be exchanged for a sound one from the armory's store, which was both generous and slightly judgmental. The steward spoke little, only nodding approval or frowning at poor gear. He knew many by name and greeted them with brief, steady words that landed like handshakes. Beside the steward stood the captain of the guard, a veteran with scars and calm bearing. His eye was sharp but not unkind, sort of gaze that tightened a strap from across the field. He showed a lad how to tie his sword belt properly, adjusted the straps on a farmer's borrowed breastplate, and spoke quietly to a frightened boy of 16 until the lad stood straighter. The captain understood fear. He had seen it before many times, and knew it behaved better when spoken to gently. As the sun climbed, the green grew busier. Pages brought barrels of ale and bread from the castle kitchens for those waiting their turn. No feast, but bravery rises nicely on yeast. Horses stamped and blew clouds of breath into the cool air. Children darted about until mothers caught them and drew them close, the world briefly arranged by a hand on a shoulder. Old men stood watching, silent and grave. The clang of hammers still rang from the blacksmith's shed nearby as last-minute repairs were made, the metal learning its lines at the edge of the stage. At mid-morning the Lord himself appeared. He rode out from the castle gate in mail and surcoat, his banner trailing behind, accompanied by knights and squires who had perfected the art of looking solemnly useful. The crowd fell silent and bowed or doffed caps. He dismounted, speaking first to the steward, then turning to his people. His words were simple. The cause just, the levy needed, courage honoured, no poetry, which was a kind of respect. He promised fair pay, protection for families left behind, and prayers said at the chapel. His voice was steady, and though fear did not vanish, men seemed to stand taller as he spoke, like spears reminded of their purpose. After the address, the muster became more ordered. Men were grouped into companies under chosen leaders, older soldiers or trusted reeves, the ones who could count without losing their place. Each company was counted and supplied. Spears where needed, bundles of arrows, spare bowstrings, leather water flasks. The castle's armory contributed what it could. Though gear was never enough for all, somehow there was always one helmet short and one strap too long. Still, a sense of readiness began to grow, steady as a drumbeat no one had to strike. Near the edge of the green stood the chaplain with a small altar hastily set up. Men drifted there in twos and threes to kneel and receive blessing. He spoke to each in turn, hearing quick confessions, anointing foreheads with holy oil, and murmuring prayers for safety and courage. Some rose with eyes shining, others still grave but steadier. The sound of his quiet Latin carried faintly through the hubbub, half lullaby, half lifeline. By noon, the levy looked more like an army. Banners had been brought out, simple flags for each company, often marked with little more than a colour or a crude symbol so men could find their place in the press of battle. The captain drilled them gently. How to stand in line, how to brace spears, how to keep shields locked together, also how not to argue with a horn. It was rough and imperfect, but it built a little confidence and gave shape to the day's purpose, as if the green itself drew straighter lines. Families lingered at the edges, offering food or tightening straps one last tie. Wives tied charms to their husbands' arms, a bit of ribbon, a small saint's medal, a braid of hair, light things, heavy with intent. Mothers kissed sons with quiet fierceness. Children clung and cried until lifted high for a last hug, a view of bravery from safe altitude. These goodbyes were done without wailing. The people knew war was part of life, but each parting carried weight that hung from the heart like iron. As afternoon waned, the steward gave the signal to prepare for departure. Supplies were loaded onto wagons, sacks of grain, barrels of ale, spare weapons, everything you might need, except certainty. The smith hammered a final rivet into a helm before handing it off to its owner, who promised it a careful life. The lord mounted his horse, as did his knights, while the footmen gathered under their banners. The captain walked among them, offering last bits of advice. Keep close, mind the signal horn, trust the man at your side. Wisdom in short sentences. The chaplain moved once more among the ranks, sprinkling holy water, murmuring blessings. Some men knelt briefly, others bowed their heads without moving. The setting sun cast long shadows across the green, turning the spears into a small forest of dark points, trees that would not root where they stood. The air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts, fear, pride, duty, and the quiet hope of return, folded and tucked away like letters. At last the horn sounded. The drawbridge was lowered, and the first company stepped off the green toward the road. Boots thudded on packed earth, hooves clattered behind as the lord and his knights took the lead. Wagons creaked under their loads, families waved until the column was nearly out of sight, then turned back to the work of waiting, which is a craft of its own. The green emptied slowly, leaving only trampled grass and a few stray feathers from the geese that had wandered earlier in the day, critics without credentials. When the last soldier was gone and dusk had fallen, the steward closed his roll of names and gave it to a page for safekeeping, the day reduced to ink and fibres. The blacksmith banked his fire and shut the forge. The chaplain lingered to pray briefly for those who had departed. In the distance, the fading sound of the marching column echoed faintly, before it was swallowed by the hills, like a story finishing its own sentence. The castle gates closed at nightfall. Inside, the keep returned to its quiet rhythms, supper in the hall, candles in the windows, yet all knew the levy was gone. In cottages and farmsteads, beds felt emptier, prayers were said with extra fervour. The muster of arms was over, and the long waiting had begun, gentle as a tide and just as patient. Battle was not a single shout and clash, but a long day stitched from many threads of sound, smell, sight, and fear. It began before dawn, when dew still lay on grass and mist clung in hollows. Men woke to drums, to horns, to the calls of sergeants shouting names in the grey light. Horses stamped impatiently, harness clinked in the half-dark. Fires that had burned low in the camp were doused, leaving only the smoke of wet embers. The air tasted of iron, damp earth, and nerves. Breakfast. Optional. Adrenaline. Not. The priests walked the lines first. Their hands lifted crosses, sprinkled water, traced blessings on helmets and faces. Words of Latin rolled like tide, half understood but wholly felt. Men crossed themselves, some fervently, some hastily, some with hands that shook. A chaplain held aloft a relic, a bone in a crystal, a splinter of wood in silver, and for a moment every eye followed it, believing that heaven itself might bend to the field. Then the relic was returned to its case, and the men returned to their weapons. Division of labour clearly defined. The captains arrayed their companies, knights took the van, mounted on horses armoured with chamfrons of steel, their riders gleaming in mail and plate, lances upright like a forest of pale trunks. Behind them stood the men-at-arms, each with spear, axe or sword, shields painted with simple marks of family or village. Archers were ordered to the flanks, their bows unstrung until the last moment to save strength. Crossbowmen wound their cranks with slow patience. In the rear, carts and baggage clustered, guarded by the old and the sick, by boys too young for the line but too stubborn to stay behind. Everyone contributes, some more loudly than others. Across the field the enemy formed their own pattern. Banners lifted, each a square of colour stitched with beasts or crosses. Horns answered horns, drums rumbled like answering thunder. Men squinted through the mist, trying to read faces on the other side, faces they might meet in minutes with iron. Between the two hosts stretched a no-man's land of trampled grass, ditches, and a few solitary trees that had the misfortune to stand where history would pass. Birds wheeled above, restless, sensing the storm to come. Excellent birds, terrible day. The noise swelled as the sun lifted. Horses snorted, pouring earth that steamed under their weight. Shields banged together in practice blows, a rhythm meant to stiffen courage. Archers tested strings, quarrels clicked into place. Men prayed again, muttered in dialects that were foreign even to their neighbours. Others sang snatches of song, rough voices rising above the din like crows startled from a field. The sound of an army waiting is not silence, it is a great murmuring sea, restless and dangerous. Hold music, drums. Then came the signal, trumpets braying, drums pounding, banners dipping forward. The archers loosed first. A cloud of arrows rose, hissing like rain, darkening the air for a breath before falling into the enemy line. Shields lifted, men ducked, horses reared. The sound was not one note but 100. The whistle, the thunk, the cry, the silence after. Crossbows answered, bolts flying lower, harder, thudding into wood and flesh with the certainty of quarrels that care nothing for nobility. Equality, arrow style. The cavalry moved next. Lances lowered, spurs pressed, horses surged forward in a pounding thunder that rolled across the field. Dust rose, grass bent, the earth trembled under the weight of iron and will. The charge was a wall of motion, banners streaming, pennons snapping, sunlight flashing on steel. For those who faced it, Pine slowed. The ground shook, the noise filled lungs, and every instinct screamed to flee. Only discipline and the press of comrades kept the line standing. Peer pressure, unexpectedly useful. Impact was chaos, given voice. Lances shattered like trees in a storm, splinters flying. Men screamed as they were lifted from saddles or flung aside. Horses collided, screamed, fell, and rolled. Swords flashed as knights drew steel and hacked at close range. The melee swallowed order. Lines folded inward. Dust and sweat and blood turned the world brown and red. Men struck at shadows as much as foes, barely able to see for the press. To fight in such a moment was less skill than survival, less art than raw instinct. Style points unavailable. On the flanks, archers continued their work. They loosed arrow after arrow until fingers bled and shoulders burned. The air above the battle was alive, a storm of wood and feather, falling and rising, never still. Crossbowmen shot slower but with deadly certainty, each bolt aimed with care. Some climbed trees or small rises to send death from above. They became the invisible hand that tipped the balance, though songs would not remember their names. Ballads have priority. Foot soldiers pressed forward where cavalry had broken through or faltered. Spears lowered, shields overlapped, they advanced step by step, pushing against their foes like waves grinding at a cliff. The clash of shield against shield, of spear against mail, of axe against helm, made a music harsh and unending. Men grunted with effort, teeth clenched, sweat dripping into eyes. A comrade fell, another stepped into the gap without thought, for a broken line is a death sentence to all. Group project, serious version. Amid the din, standards waved, rising and dipping as their bearers fought to stay upright. A banner falling was more than cloth, it was a heart struck low. Men fought harder where their colours flew, knowing that to lose them was shame. Captains shouted themselves hoarse, voices cracking in the dust. Horns tried to call order, but often their notes were swallowed by the greater roar. In the thick of battle, commands turned to gestures, gestures to instinct, instinct to sheer survival. Communication plan improvised. The ground grew slick, and footing betrayed the unwary. Men slipped, shields fell from numbed hands, weapons dropped and were seized by others. The dead and the dying lay together, sometimes dragged aside, sometimes trampled where they fell. Blood mingled with earth, becoming mud that clung to boots and hooves alike. Horses floundered, men cursed, and still the fight ground on, relentless. Battle was less a storm and more a mill, grinding grain of flesh and steel together until both were unrecognizable. Productivity disturbingly high. Fear walked the field, but so did courage. Some men fled, breaking ranks, running with eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. Others stood where no one expected them, holding a breach with stubbornness beyond reason. A boy with a broken spear shafted it anew with rage and fought like a veteran. An old man shielded 3 youths until an axe struck him down. These small acts were lost in the greater tide, yet they were the true marrow of battle, unsung except here. By midday the sun was high, the air thick with smoke and dust. Men panted like beasts, armour chafed and burned, throats begged for water. Skins were drained in seconds, the wounded cried for drink more than for healing. Surgeons worked at the rear under awnings, knives flashing, cloths darkening, hands steady as they cut and bound. Women and boys carried buckets, fetching and spilling, their faces pale but resolute. The camp behind the battle became its shadow, sharing in the labour if not in the clash. Support staff, indispensable. Sometimes battle turned not on courage but on chance. A riderless horse galloped through lines, scattering men. A banner fell in mud mistaken for defeat, and panic spread like fire. A captain's cry was misheard, and men wheeled where they should have pressed. Or the opposite. A rumour of victory raced down the line and men found fresh strength they did not know they had. The tide shifted and shifted again, unpredictable as the sea, forecast changeable. When at last one side broke, it was rarely graceful. The line wavered, Shouts changed from challenge to terror, and then men turned. Shields were cast aside for speed, spears dropped, helmets flung off to run lighter. The victors pressed, cutting down the slow, shouting to drive the rout. Dust rose again, this time from many feet fleeing. Pursuit was fierce, but commanders tried to restrain it. An army lost in chase to be ambushed as surely as an army lost in flight. Caution still advised. At dusk, the field lay littered. Broken weapons, fallen banners, bodies still in the posture of their last breath. Ravens circled, already bold. Survivors limped back to camp, some triumphant, many dazed, all exhausted. Water was poured over heads, wine into mouths, bread into hands. Surgeons worked until stars lit their tables. Priests murmured prayers over the dying, sometimes cut short by another call. The night air was full of groans, of whispered names, of silence where answers should have come. Debrief ongoing. Victory was claimed in words, but on the ground it was harder to see. The cost lay everywhere, in blood and ash and broken steel. Songs would be written, chroniclers would gild the day, but those who had stood in the press remembered less the glory than the dust, the noise, the weight of another man's body against their own, the choking thirst, the ache of fear never wholly mastered. Highlights reel, mislead. Battle joined was a single clash but a long crucible, testing more than strength of arm. It measured patience, discipline, endurance, and the stubborn will to hold when all wanted to flee. When night fell and fires burned once more, men looked into the flames and saw again the faces of those who would not share the warmth, and they knew that tomorrow the war itself would continue, even if this day's clash was ended. Intermission, the finale. War did not live only on battlefields or in castles under siege. Its longest shadow stretched over villages, small fragile hearts of the countryside, where most souls drew breath. Here, in timber houses roofed with thatch, among fields bounded by hedges and low stone walls, life was meant to move to the rhythm of seasons, not to the beat of drums. But when armies stirred, villages became way stations, victims, refuges, and graveyards. Seasons prefer consistency. War does not. The first sign of war was often not soldiers, but rumor. A peddler spoke of raiders across the border, of barns burned, of a town sacked. A shepherd saw smoke rising too straight, too thick, from beyond the ridge. A boy returned from market say he had seen carts loaded with spears, men with faces too young for war, swaggering in borrowed mail. Rumour ran quicker than hoofbeats, quicker even than fear. In cottages that smelled of bread and smoke, families looked at each other in silence, each wondering what to pack, what to hide, what to abandon. As couriers go, rumour runs marathons. Then came the requisitioners. They bore the Lord's seal, sometimes even his men-at-arms, demanding grain for the army, hay for horses, carts to carry baggage. Sometimes they paid with promissory notes or clipped coin. Often they did knit. A farmer who hesitated found his stores broken open, his oxes driven away. A miller who argued too loudly was struck down, his mill seized for flour. The law rode with them, in voice if did injustice. To the village, war was first a hunger in other men's bellies. Receipts were, shall we say, theoretical. Next came the passing army itself. The sound was heard long before, hooves drumming, carts creaking, men shouting, horns blowing. Dust rose like storm clouds settling on hedges and thatch. Villagers pressed against doorways clutching children, as knights clattered past, banners snapping, faces hidden behind visors. Behind them trudged foot soldiers, weary and foul-tempered, their eyes searching for food, drink, diversion. Behind them came the baggage train, a crawling beast of carts, animals, women and children, followed by stragglers who lived on the army's leavings. If dust could charge rent, it would. For some villages, the army simply passed, leaving broken fences, trampled fields, a few chickens stolen. For others, it halted. Then the village became a camp. Fields were stripped bare for fodder, barns emptied for grain, houses crowded with uninvited guests. Fires were kindled in the green, pigs slaughtered, bread taken. Soldiers drank deep, dice clattered, songs rose, laughter mingled with threats. A cottage could be turned upside down in an hour. Furniture smashed for firewood, walls blackened by smoke, gardens flattened by hooves. When the army marched dough, it left emptiness behind. Hospitality redefined. Worst of all were the raiders, whether enemy soldiers or mercenaries who owed loyalty only to coin. They came suddenly, fast riders with torches, whooping to scare before striking. They plundered grain, carried off animals, broke doors, took what they desired. Women hid in woods, children under beds, elders beneath floorboards. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Flames licked thatch, barns roared into fire, fields crackled. Smoke rose in columns that told neighbours far away war had come. Customer service was intermittent at best. Some villages had small defences, a ditch, a hedge, a palisade around the green, carts drawn into a circle. Men stood with spears, boys with slings, women with stones. They rang church bells not for mass but for warning, summoning all who could stand. The priest lifted a cross before the gate, hoping its sight might turn swords aside. Sometimes it worked. More often, it brought only a pause. Against armoured riders, wood and courage broke quickly. The best defence was flight. Courage helps. Timber still snaps. Flight was its own trial. Families bundled what they could, bread, blankets, a crucifix, a pot. They drove cattle before them, children tugging at ropes. They hurried into woods, into marshes, into caves, into ruins of old walls left by Romans or giants. There they hid, listening to shouts in the distance, watching smoke rise, hoping the wind carried it away. In those moments the forest became both prison and sanctuary. Twigs snapped underfoot sounded like pursuit. Owls hooting felt like taunts. Yet in the silence life clung to itself with stubbornness. 5 stars for camouflage, 0 for comfort. War's hunger lasted long after armies passed. A field trampled in May meant no harvest in August. A barn burned meant winter famine. A well fouled meant sickness. Villages leaned on neighbours, on monasteries, on the mercy of lords who themselves were pressed thin. Bread was stretched with acorns, broth thinned with water until it was more memory than meal. Children's bellies swelled with want. Elders gave at their portion quietly. Songs at hearths grew quieter, but they did not cease, for singing is a weapon against despair. Culinary reviews were mixed. War left scars in stories too. Children who had seen raiders never forgot the sound of hooves at night. Women who had hidden in ditches remembered the cold mud more vividly than their prayers. Old men spoke of years when war came twice, and fields lay fallow for 3. Each scar became a tale, told not to frighten but to teach. Keep food hidden, keep paths to the woods clear, trust no promise of peace too quickly. Memory was the one fortification a village could carry with it. Lessons stay packed longer than luggage. Yet villages endured. They rebuilt walls with fresh wattle, thatched roofs anew, planted again in fields that still held the bones of battle. Bells rang once more for mass. Children ran barefoot over ground where blood had dried and faded. Grain sprouted, lambs bleated. Laughter returned hesitantly, then boldly. Life in villages had always been precarious, balanced on weather, on harvest, on pestilence. War was another storm, crueler but not final. The soil, when turned, still yielded bread. Weather remained stubbornly apolitical. In time, minstrels passed through and sang of the great lords, of battles won and banners taken. Villagers listened politely, then told their own tales by firelight, of the day the priest rang the bell until his arms failed, of the child who led cattle into the woods and saved them all, of the widow who fed 10 mouths from one hidden sack of grain. So the memory of war in the village was not only one of loss, but of resilience. Fields trampled could be sown again, barns burned could be rebuilt, wounds could scar and still leave hands strong for harvest. What remained was the will to endure, to sing, to plant, to teach children how to listen for danger and how to rejoice when peace returned. In this, villages proved stronger than castles, stronger than lords, stronger than war itself. Resilience, the quiet superpower. And when, years later, the next rumor of conflict stirred, when smoke rose once more on a horizon, villagers prepared again. They had learned war's lessons harshly, but they had learned them, and as long as the earth bore seed and the church bell could ring, they would meet the shadow and outlast it. For villagers were the true heart of the land, and even war could not silence their beating forever. Prepared, but still hoping not to need it. War in the Middle Ages didn't march alone, it carried with it the church, in banners, in relics, in prayers whispered by lips both fearful and fierce. Faith stood at the edge of battlefields, and in the middle of them, binding men's courage to heaven and offering meaning where death was near. If armor clothed the body, faith clothed the spirit. If walls guarded the flesh, belief guarded the soul. Armor for the inside, essentially. From the moment war was declared, the language of faith shaped its course. A lord did not simply call his men to arms, he called them to defend the just cause, the rightful claim, the holy vow. Bishops wrote letters, monks copied sermons that framed quarrels as righteous. Even feuds over fields and castles were dressed in sacred cloth. Priests stood in pulpits and urged villagers to support their lord, for to refuse was not only disobedience, but sin. The church lent its voice to war, and in return, war lent its coin and protection to the church. Marketing, but medieval. Before armies marched, they gathered for mass. A priest in white or gold vestments lifted chalice and paten, blessing bread and wine that became the presence of Christ. Men knelt on grass or dirt, helmets at their sides, hearing words that promised forgiveness if their hearts were contrite. Confession was urged, sins named quickly and earnestly, as if the lips could outrun the sword that might fall tomorrow. To go into battle with an unshriven soul was to gamble with eternity, speed-running absolution. Relics were carried into war like talismans of heaven. A bone of a saint in a jeweled reliquary, a fragment of the true cross mounted in silver, a cloak once worn by a martyr. These were borne before troops, lifted high on poles, kissed by captains. Men touched them as they passed, whispering prayers, believing that splinters of sanctity could turn aside arrows and blunt blades. Some banners themselves were relics, stitched by nuns, blessed by bishops, consecrated with holy oil. To see such a banner fall was terror. To see it raised was hope renewed. Carry on, holiness. On the field itself, priests walked the lines, not with swords but with crosses and words. They sprinkled holy water over helmets, murmured psalms, lifted crucifixes for men to see. Some stood behind the ranks, shouting blessings as if to hurl them over men's shoulders into the fray. A few even carried arms, though canon law forbade it. Most carried only faith, believing it weapon enough. When men fell, priests knelt beside them, giving absolution in hurried whispers before breath ceased. Faith was as present in battle as steel. Coverage ranged from comforting to courageous. For many, war itself was framed as holy duty. Crusades were the most vivid example, preached from pulpits, promised with indulgences. To take the cross was to bind one's life to Christ's service, to trade earthly peril for heavenly assurance. But even lesser wars could be called holy, defending a shrine, resisting pagans, upholding a vow sworn on relics. Faith sanctified violence, give it shape and meaning. Without faith, war was terror. With faith, it could be painted as sacrifice. Purpose is a strong spice. Yet faith also tried to limit war's cruelty. Bishops and councils proclaimed the peace of God and the truce of God, forbidding violence against peasants, clergy and the poor, forbidding fighting on holy days. In truth, such rules were often broken, but they spoke of a world that longed for restraint. A knight might hesitate before striking a priest, if only for fear of excommunication. A soldier might spare a church, fearing to anger its patron saint. Faith planted seeds of mercy, hidden in hard ground, aspirational, if uneven in practice. In sieges, churches became both sanctuary and target. Defenders carried relics in processions along the walls, chanting psalms while arrows hissed above. Priests rang bells, not only for mass but for warning, their echoes mixing with the thud of stones on timber. Sometimes attackers spared a church, sometimes they did knit, knowing that to desecrate one was both terror and strategy. Within walls, chapels filled with prayers, women lighting candles, men kneeling with bowed heads, children clutching rosaries. The rhythm of worship continued, even as war pressed close. Bell schedule dynamic. The wounded sought comfort in faith as much as in herbs. A man bleeding from an arrow prayed to Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows yet still whole. One burned by fire called on Saint Lawrence, who suffered upon a gridiron. Pilgrims' badges sewn to cloaks were kissed and pressed to wounds. Priests anointed with oil, laid hands, whispered of heaven's nearness. Some believed miracles happened, wounds closing, fevers breaking. Whether miracle or mercy of time, the hope itself was a healing. Hope is half the medicine. Death on the field was heavy, but faith gave it shape. Men believed they fought under heaven's gaze, that saints interceded, that prayers would follow them beyond the grave. Priests carried lists of the dead, read their names in churches after, wove them into masses that echoed for generations. A knight slain in battle was remembered in chronicles. A peasant slain was remembered in candles lit by his kin. Both were entrusted to God, for faith taught that no one fell unseen. Roll call continues, one way or another. Songs told of saints appearing in battle, St. George riding with a white horse, the Virgin spreading her cloak over soldiers, angels striking down foes. Whether seen by eyes or born of hope, such visions gave strength. Chroniclers copied them into books, minstrels sang them in halls. Faith turned horror into wonder, gave shape to courage, made sense of chaos. Where war was incomprehensible, faith wrote a story. Eyewitness accounts may vary, morale appreciated. But faith also asked for penance. Men who returned bore not only scars but guilt. They gave coin for masses, built chapels in thanksgiving, went on pilgrimage to cleanse their souls. Some laid down arms and entered monasteries, seeking peace for lives haunted by battle. Others gave alms to widows and orphans, hoping to balance what war had taken. Faith was not only shield and banner, it was also mirror and burden, reminding men that God's justice was not always the same as their own. Guilt has a good memory. And so, in war, faith was both sword and salve, justification and restraint, courage and consolation. It marched in relics, it sang in psalms, it whispered at deathbeds, it thundered in sermons. Men carried it like they carried spears, not always willingly, not always perfectly, but always present, two-edged by design. When the field was silent at last, when fires burned low and groans faded, the chaplains remained. They gathered bodies, spoke blessings, lifted hands heavy with the weight of names. They dug graves, marked crosses, lit candles against the dark, and in the silence their prayers rose, fragile but persistent, like smoke from a battlefield seeking heaven, carrying the souls of the fallen, binding war once more into the endless story of faith. Someone has to close the book. War might rage with steel and fire, but its beginning and ending often came by parchment, by seal, by words written in careful hands. Law, in the medieval world, was both leash and language for conflict. It didn't always restrain, but it shaped the way lords quarrelled, the way truces were sworn, the way peace was imagined. If battle was the storm, law was the attempt to channel its rain into furrows rather than floods. Weather reports available upon signature. Every war began with claims. A lord declared that this land was his by inheritance, that his neighbour had broken an oath, that insult or trespass demanded satisfaction. Charters were read aloud in courts, seals displayed, genealogies recited as if memory itself were weapon. Scribes drew long family trees, monks copied chronicles that supported one side. Disputes over fields were wrapped in the cloth of justice until they looked like matters of God and right rather than hunger and pride. The language of law dressed ambition in dignity. Ambition loves a good cloak. Declarations of war were often given formality. A herald, cloaked in the colours of his master, rode to the enemy gate and shouted words that echoed for all to hear. My lord demands his rights. My lord takes up arms. May God judge between you. Sometimes a letter was delivered, sealed with wax, bearing threats written in careful Latin. The ceremony was not to make war polite, it was to make it legitimate. For in a world where oaths bound men to lords and lords to kings, war without words was outlawry, etiquette, but with helmets. Once begun, wars were fenced with rules of conduct, at least in theory. Knights swore codes of chivalry, not to strike clergy, not to harm women, not to burn churches, to honour ransom rather than slaughter. These promises were broken often, but they lingered as ideals. Captives of rank were expected to be spared and held for ransom, their lives more profitable than their deaths. Common men, alas, were less fortunate, but e'en they sometimes found mercy when captains feared the anger of saints or bishops. Law in war was imperfect, but it was a thread that could still bind hands, not quality, variable. The Church sought to restrain war through the peace of God and the truce of God. Councils declared that peasants, pilgrims, monks and clerics were to be unharmed, that livestock and crops were to be spared. Later, the truce of God forbade fighting on holy days, especially Sundays, Lent and feast days. Bishops thundered against those who ignored these decrees, excommunication was threatened, bells tolled in warning. Enforcement was uneven, yet the very attempt revealed a yearning that even in violence some spaces, sometimes, must be sacred. Ambition may argue, bells still ring. Within kingdoms, kings held courts to arbitrate disputes. Two lords might bring their quarrel before a royal bench, each producing charters, each swearing oaths. The king might order trial by combat, letting God's judgment decide in the clash of champions. Or he might impose his own authority, declaring the land for one side, binding both under threat of forfeiture. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it festered, but the process reminded lords that they were not only warriors but vassals, bound to a larger order. Hierarchy, nature's filing system. When war wearied both sides, they sought truces. A truce might last a day, a week, a season. Messengers carried terms across lines. Heralds shouted agreements in both camps. At dusk, torches flared along ditches as men lowered weapons, watching each other warily, daring to trust that words could still hold. A truce allowed burial of the dead, exchange of prisoners, parley for ransom. For a few hours, the field grew strangely quiet, as if both sides remembered they were men before enemies. Silence, brief, valuable. Negotiating peace was a labour as hard as battle. Envoys met in chapels, abbots presided, charters were drawn up. They debated borders, whether the river belonged to this lord or that, whether the castle stood within one shire or another. They argued over hostages, sons of noble houses, given as guarantees of faith. They haggled over fines, reparations, the return of relics or books carried off in raids. Seals were affixed with solemnity, oaths were sworn upon relics, witnesses signed with trembling hands. Peace was written into the bones of parchment. Please initial here, here, and near the relic. Sometimes marriage sealed peace more firmly than ink. A daughter of one house was wed to the son of another, uniting bloodlines that had spilled each other's blood. Feasts were held, banners flown, songs sung to drown the memory of war. Yet behind the smiles the bride might weep, the groom might scowl, and both households watched carefully. Marriage was both sacrament and strategy, an attempt to weave threads strong enough to hold swords in their scabbards. Love may follow, logistics arrive first. Peace did not always hold. Oaths were broken, seals ignored, hostages escaped. Chroniclers wrote with weary pens of treaties that lasted a season, of truces shattered by a raid, of lords who found excuse to quarrel anew. Yet each time, law was called upon again, as if parchment could mend what iron tore. The persistence of law, however frail, revealed a truth. Men longed for order even in war, for rules to govern chaos, for words to soften wounds. Hope renews its subscription. For common folk, law's peace was felt in small mercies. When a truce was proclaimed, markets reopened, mills ground grain, fields were sown. Merchants returned to roads, pilgrims to shrines. Bells rang, not for alarm but for worship. Children played without fear of hoofbeats. A week of peace could not erase months of hunger, but it could plant hope. Villagers didn't read charters, but they knew when words written far away reached their doors in bread and quiet, fine print, edible at last. At times, law itself was mocked by war's enormity. A peasant watching his barn burn cared little for parchment signed in Latin. Yet even he might find that, months later, the same parchment ordered restitution, returned a strip of land, forbade a lord's further cruelty. Imperfect though it was, law remained a net that caught some fragments of justice. Not watertight, better than nothing. And so war and peace in law were a dance, clumsy and repetitive, yet necessary. War without law was banditry, law without enforcement was ink without meaning. Together, they created a rhythm by which kingdoms endured, by which memory was shaped, by which the hope of order survived, not graceful, still useful. When peace was sworn at last, when banners were lowered and armies disbanded, parchment was stored in chests, seals kept in churches, chronicles copied in scriptoria. The battlefield might still stink of blood, but in the halls of abbots and kings, words were spoken that bound the future. Men laid aside swords, at least for a tie, believing that God, saints and law would keep them. And even if the peace frayed, for a season it held, and the land breathed again, exhale quietly. When the smoke cleared from fields, when broken spears were swept into piles and bodies laid in earth, war did not end. It lingered in memory, it travelled in song. The clash of swords and thunder of hooves faded, but stories carried them further than steel ever could. For in a world where parchment was scarce and few could read, the voices of singers, the tales of elders, and the chants of priests preserved what men wished never to forget, or never to admit. Archiving. Mostly acoustic. In great halls, minstrels and troubadours sang of battles. Their verses praised lords, gilding victories, softening defeats. A knight who had broken through the enemy line was likened to a lion. A standard lifted in the dust became a miracle of heaven. To listen was to be carried back into the storm of war, but in music, chaos was made noble. Harps twanged, fiddles sang, drums beat time like hoofbeats. Men who had fled on that day thumped their cups and shouted with pride, for song remade them as heroes. Memory in halls was a sweetened wine, strong enough to drown truth, pairs well with applause. But outside halls, in villages and by hearths, memory wore another face. Old men told children of the night raiders came, of barns burned, of women hiding in woods. They spoke of hunger winters, of fields left bare, of neighbours lost and never seen again. Their stories were less gilded, more raw. They were not sung with lutes but whispered by firelight, punctuated with the crack of wood. Children listened wide-eyed, learning not glory but caution. Keep food hidden, trust no promise of peace too easily, run when hoofbeats sound at night. These were songs too, though without melody, songs of survival. Chorus. Shh. Churches preserved memory in liturgy. The names of the dead were written in parish books, read aloud on anniversaries. Masses for the fallen were sung, incense rising like the smoke of battle long after the clash itself had ended. Priests prayed for mercy on those who died without confession, for souls cut short on muddy fields. Candles burned for knights and peasants alike, their wax dripping like tears. Faith transformed war's dead into intercessors, reminding the living that each soul was counted, each name spoken before God. Attendance eternal. Chroniclers in monasteries recorded war in ink, quills scratching by candlelight. Their accounts mingled fact and vision, who marched where, who struck first, which lord was brave, which cowardly, how God's will was shown in victory or defeat. They quoted psalms, compared captains to figures from scripture, saw portents in eclipses and comets. Their parchments would outlast the songs of minstrels, yet even they were shaped by who paid for ink, who fed the scribe. Memory in books was sharp but not always clean, footnotes occasionally sponsored. Ballads spread among common folk, simple rhymes sung while spinning or walking to market. They named villages burned, lovers parted, lords who betrayed their men, saints who appeared in battle. The melodies were plain, the verses repeated, until children learned them by heart. Ballads could not be erased, for they lived in mouths, not in books. Lords feared them, for a ballad could turn victory to shame, could preserve failure longer than a chronicle. Memory in song was unruly, a truth no sword could silence. Good luck cross-examining a tune. At feasts, knights told their own tales, boasting of charges, of duels, of wounds taken. Scars were displayed like relics, each with a story that grew taller each telling. A dented helm was passed around with laughter, its crack explained as the work of 10 men, though it may have been only one lucky blow. These stories bound comradeship, turned terror into fellowship. Memory at table was laughter masking sorrow, pride masking fear. Exaggeration served hot. But war left memories not only in words, it lived in scars upon the land. A burned village rebuilt, but blackened stones lingered. A field where men had fallen grew strangely fertile or strangely barren, and folk spoke of it in hushed tones. A ditch dug for defence became a hollow where children played, yet elders remembered bodies buried there. Roads bore ruts from armies' wheels long after peace returned. The earth itself remembered, though it spoke only in shapes and silences. Landscape, quiet historian. Mothers remembered differently. They counted the days their sons had been gone, the winters endured without them, the nights prayed through in fear. Some never saw their sons return. Others saw them return changed, their eyes older than their years, their laughter dimmed. Mothers wove memory into lullabies, warning children not to be taken by war's promises. Their songs were gentler, but they carried iron in their heart. Soft voice, hard lesson. Not all memory was sorrow. Victories brought pageants and processions. Cities hung banners from windows, bells rang, relics were carried in triumph. Knights rode with garlands, squires with flowers, the lord's colours painted on faces and walls. Songs of triumph echoed through streets, wine flowed, bread was shared. For a day or a week, memory was bright, and the shadow of loss was pushed aside. But when the garlands faded, the widows still wore black. Confetti has a short half-life. Generations later, memory hardened into legend. A knight who held a bridge against many became a hero whose name was sung for centuries. A siege that lasted months became a tale of miraculous endurance. A saint seen in battle became part of the land's very story. Legends forgot famine, forgot slaughter, forgot the nameless dead. They remembered courage, loyalty, divine favor. Memory became heritage, and war's pain was dressed in the robes of pride. Archival editing, enthusiast grade. Yet even legend could not erase the quiet songs sung in cottages, the sighs of fields, the scars on hearts. Both lived side by side, proud memory and the painful, the song of triumph and the whisper of grief. Together, they made the true story of war, not only banners and knights, but barns and widows, children and prayers. Duet, not solo. In the end, memory and song were themselves a kind of battle. One side sought to ennoble, to make sense, to give glory. The other sought to remember, to warn, to endure. Both were necessary, for without glory men would not march, and without warning they would not learn. War's echo was never silence, it was voices, singing, weeping, praying, boasting, teaching. And those voices carried farther than steel into the ears of generations unborn. Transmission excellent. When the clash of arms was past, when hooves no longer churned the earth, when banners hung limp and torn in rain or were rolled away into chests, war did not vanish. It left behind a long shadow, stretching over villages and towns, over fields and castles, over memories and prayers. The shadow of war was as real as its fire, and often lasted longer. In the medieval world, men and women lived not only in the moment of battle, but also in the years and lifetimes that followed, carrying scars both visible and hidden. Aftershocks, but for history. The land bore the first scars. A battlefield, once a meadow or a farmer's plot, became a place of bones. Long after men had gathered the dead and dug trenches to bury them, the earth remembered. Ploughs struck against iron where swords had broken. Children found arrowheads in streams. Shepherds herded flocks over ground where grass grew oddly lush from blood or strangely barren from fire. Ruins of burned barns stood black against sky, stones cracked by heat, timbers charred. A castle repaired its breaches, but the patchwork lines of lighter stone reminded all who looked. This wall had once failed. This wall had once groaned under the weight of war. Architecture with footnotes. Even more than stones, it was the fields that carried war's memory. A season lost to trampled grain meant hunger in winter. A barn burned in August meant famine by February. Villagers learned to hide seed in secret pits, to spread food between neighbours, to mend ploughs with scraps when iron was gone. Children grew thin, and mothers learned to stretch porridge with acorns, to bake bread from roots and husks. The shadow of war lay across harvests for years, long after banners had marched elsewhere. Recipes not recommended. The people themselves bore scars. A soldier came home with one arm gone, and he learned to plough with the other, while his son guided the ox. Another returned with a limp, hobbling on crutches, his pride mixed with shame. Some returned whole in body but haunted in spirit, waking at night to cries only they could hear, seeing again the press of battle in every shadow. Children grew up faster in such homes, carrying water, tending fields, while their fathers sat silent by the fire. Women who had held households through sieges or raids often carried a new strength, and sometimes a bitterness that changed the way families lived. Growth rings, human version. War left its mark on faith too. Priests preached of judgment, of God's hand in victories and defeats. Some said war was punishment for sin, others called it trial, a test of devotion. Relics were honoured more fiercely, processions more fervent, yet doubts crept in as well. Why had God allowed such slaughter? Why had the innocent suffered alongside the guilty? In chapels where candles flickered before broken crucifixes, men and women wrestled with questions too large for parchment or sermon. The shadow of war stretched den into souls, questions plentiful, answers shy. In law and custom the shadow was written down. Charters marked borders redrawn by treaties. Hostages exchanged between lords grew into men who remembered captivity as part of their childhood. Fines were levied on villages that had supported the wrong side. New taxes paid for walls rebuilt. Laws forbidding raids or demanding safe passage for pilgrims were written after each war, attempts to bind the next quarrel before it began. Each ink stroke carried the weight of conflict past, preventative paperwork. Yet the shadow of war was not only grief, it also shaped memory into legend. Stories of courage were told around fires of the knight who held a bridge, the squire who saved his lord, the widow who hid grain and fed the village through winter. Children grew up hearing these tales as if they were scripture. Minstrels embroidered them with rhyme and melody, so that war's sharp edges dulled into song. War's shadow reached forward into pride, binding communities with shared remembrance of endurance. Polish applied, edges remain. At times, war's shadow took the form of caution and restraint. Lords who had seen famine hesitated before declaring feud again. Villagers built hedges thicker, stored more grain, forged stronger plowshares. Monasteries walled their cloisters not only against wolves of fur, but wolves of steel. Watchmen kept sharper eyes, and shepherds learned to count not only their sheep, but the riders on distant hills. Memory became a kind of armour, shaping habits that made the next storm less sudden. Experience, inconvenient, invaluable. For some, war's shadow led to penance and change. A knight who had slain many might give lands to found a monastery, his sword laid on an altar as offering. A lord might pay for candles to burn perpetually for the souls of the dead, hoping their light would ease his own conscience. Pilgrimages multiplied, men walking barefoot to shrines, women carrying offerings across mountains. War taught that peace, however fragile, was precious, and that to seek it was holy work. Course correction, candlelit. Yet peace itself was often brief. The shadow of one war became the seed of the next. Old grudges lingered. Borders disputed once would be disputed again. A son grew old, vowing to reclaim what his father had lost. Chronicles, meant to preserve truth, sometimes preserved anger instead, keeping memory alive not as balm but as blade. Thus the shadow of war was both warning and temptation, reminding men of both loss and pride. Memories come with edges. And always beneath it all, life continued. Fields were sown, children baptized, weddings celebrated. Bells rang for feast days, markets bustled, songs rose from alehouses. The shadow of war did not blot out the sun. It lay alongside it, lengthening at dusk, retreating at noon, always present, always felt, but never the only thing. People lived in the shadow, but they also lived in the light. Coexistence practiced daily. In time, generations passed, and the shadow grew softer. Bones in fields turned to dust. Ruins became quarries for new houses. Names of battles faded into songs whose verses no longer matched truth. Children played in ditches that had once been defences, laughed in meadows where blood had fallen. The shadow lingered, but it no longer frightened. It became part of the landscape, part of memory, part of the story that made people who they were. Legacy tamed. For the medieval world, war was never absent. It returned like seasons, sowing sorrow as rain sows rivers. But so too did peace return, fragile, fleeting, precious. Between them lay the long shadow, remembrance of cost, the yearning for calm, the wisdom drawn from pain. And in that shadow, people found strength to rebuild, to sing, to plant, to pray, maintenance of hope. So when the stars rose over a quiet village after war, when a child's laughter rang in the night, when a candle burned before a crucifix in thanksgiving for survival, the long shadow lay still upon the land. It reminded all who walked there that war had passed, and might come again, but that life, stubborn and sacred, would always rise to meet it. Lights dim, heart steady.